Hello and welcome back. It's good to have you here tonight. So we're doing The Boys, Season 5, the final season, and given that episodes are dropping weekly on Prime Video right now, as I'm recording this, with the finale scheduled for the 20th of May 2026, it feels like exactly the right time to sit down and talk through everything, all the theories, all the character arcs, all the stuff that's been building for 4 seasons and is now, finally, actually paying off in front of us in real time. I've been watching The Boys since it first came out in 2019, and I remember the feeling of those early episodes. The shock of it, the way it kept doing things you didn't expect a superhero show to do. It had this energy of a show that genuinely didn't care about playing by the rules. And now, here we are, 7 years later, watching it end. Which is a strange thing to sit with, honestly. What I want to do tonight is less of a recap and more of a think through. We're going to wander through the season's big ideas, its characters, the theories that have been circulating, and some of the stuff that's still unresolved heading into the final 3 episodes. There's loads to cover: Homelander's god complex, Butcher's descent into something that looks increasingly like villainy, the V1 situation, and what it means for everyone. Ryan, Soldier Boy, the virus, the comics, what the ending might actually look like. All of it. If you're watching this having seen all 5 episodes currently out, you'll recognise most of what we talk about. If you're a bit behind, that's completely fine too. The theory sections are the kind of thing you can engage with at whatever level you're at. And if you want to support the channel while you're getting settled in tonight, there's a link in the description. No pressure at all. But if you enjoy what I do here, that's a lovely way to say so. Right, let's get into it. Starting, as always, by just setting the scene a bit. Where are we? What's happened? And what's the world of this show actually looking like as we hit the final stretch? So if you want to understand where Season 5 starts, you have to remember where Season 4 ended. And Season 4 ended in a fairly grim place, to put it mildly. Homelander had essentially won. Not in a dramatic, explosive way, in the slow, grinding, bureaucratic way that actual authoritarian power tends to consolidate itself. By the finale, the political infrastructure had been hollowed out in his favour. The president-elect, a man called Robert Singer, who'd been set up as the last genuine obstacle to Homelander's influence, was neutralised. Victoria Newman, who had been this whole complicated double-agent presence throughout the season, working with Homelander while secretly maintaining her own agenda, was killed by Butcher at the very end, which removed one of the few remaining people who understood how to navigate between the two worlds. And Butcher himself, in killing Newman, crossed a line that he didn't really come back from. He used his tumor-grown tentacle powers. He did it in front of Ryan, and Ryan, who had already been through so much by that point, left, which is its own kind of ending. Season 5 picks up roughly a year later. Well, it's 6 months after the Gen V Season 2 finale specifically, for reasons that matter in terms of how the show ties its universe together, but practically speaking, it's been a year of Homelander consolidating control over the United States. And the America that Season 5 shows us is something the show has been building toward for 5 years, but which still manages to feel unsettling when you actually see it rendered properly on screen. There are freedom camps now. That's the show's term for them, freedom camps, which is the kind of darkly ironic naming convention that authoritarian regimes have historically been rather good at. If you've expressed support for Starlight, if you've been identified as a Starlighter, you're liable to end up in one. Huey, Mother's Milk, and Frenchie spend the first episode imprisoned in exactly that situation, which is a lot to process when you remember that 3 seasons ago, Huey was just a bloke who worked in a record shop and had genuinely terrible luck. The country has divided itself along 2 lines, home teamers and Starlighters, which is a neat bit of world building that the show handles without over-explaining. You just understand from context what it means to be labelled one or the other, and what the consequences are. The show's done something quite clever there in making the fascism feel lived in rather than theoretical. It's not a distant threat anymore. It's the wallpaper. Ashley Barrett, who started the series as Madeline Stillwell's harried assistant and has spent several seasons being steadily promoted through the Vought hierarchy through a combination of competence and sheer survival instinct, is now Homelander's White House press secretary, which is one of those developments that feels both completely inevitable and slightly absurd. She took Compound V at the end of Season 4, we see the effect of that in Season 5, and it's properly bizarre, but we'll get to Ashley's specific arc in more detail later. The point is she's there, at the centre of the regime, doing what Ashley has always done, adapting. The boys themselves, Butcher, Annie, Kimiko, A-Train, have been doing what they can to mount a resistance. Annie's been the public-facing part of that, which makes sense given her history as Starlight and her platform. A-Train, in one of the show's better long-form character arcs, had his own complicated relationship with the resistance. And Kimiko, after finally speaking her first word at the very end of Season 4, which was no, delivered with such perfect timing that I genuinely had to rewind it, is now a slightly more vocal presence in the group's dynamics, which is a small but meaningful shift. Butcher reappears in Season 5 with the soup-killing virus that's been his project, and with the tentacle situation still very much ongoing. He also notably killed his own father at some point in the gap. There's a confirmation in Episode 3 that he left him at the bottom of the Thames, which is delivered almost as an aside, and it's the kind of detail that tells you a lot about where Butcher's head is at. He's not performing grief anymore. He's not pretending to have limits. The thing that used to sit inside him as a dark potential has just become the operating mode. Homelander, meanwhile, has embarked on something genuinely new for his character. He's going religious. He's positioning himself not just as a political figure or a corporate asset, but as a messiah, which is a trajectory the show has been carefully setting up since his first appearances. All those God-complex moments and I could laser everyone in this crowd, and they'd still love me speeches, but which Season 5 makes literal in a way that's quite something. His vice president is a puppet, his press secretary is Ashley, and he's now interested in being worshipped rather than merely adored, which is a meaningful distinction. There's a lot going on, quite a lot of moving parts. The show has always been good at maintaining multiple storylines without any of them feeling neglected, and Season 5 is managing that reasonably well, though by Episode 5 you do get the sense that everything is being funneled toward a very specific point, which is appropriate for a final season. You want things to converge. The Gen V connection is worth mentioning here because Season 5 takes place explicitly 6 months after that show's second season finale. Marie Moreau, the blood manipulation soup who was the lead character in Gen V, is referenced as having helped Annie, and the Gen V characters, Jordan Lee, Emma Meyer, Sam Kate, have joined the resistance in some form. It's a crossover that feels earned rather than gratuitous. The Gen V kids went through their own version of what the boys went through, the disillusionment with Vought, the violence, the cost of it, and so their presence here as part of the resistance makes narrative sense. They know the game now. The broader feeling of Season 5, as a viewer, is of a show that's tidying its own house. Not in a lazy way, it's still doing what The Boys does, which is finding the most uncomfortable angle on every situation and pressing on it, but there's a clarity to the storytelling that wasn't always present in the middle seasons. It knows where it's going. The question is just whether where it's going will be as devastating as Kripke has promised. And based on Episodes 1 through 5, I'd say, yes, probably. Right, so, Homelander and religion. Let's talk about this properly, because it's the most interesting thing Season 5 is doing, and probably the element that's going to define how the show is remembered. To understand where Homelander is now, you have to think about his whole psychological arc across the 5 seasons. He started as a corporate product, Vaught's most valuable asset, a man who had been raised from infancy to be a symbol. He was never given a self that wasn't constructed by someone else. Madeline Stillwell created a version of him that was manageable. Stan Edgar created a version that was useful, and then gradually, over the course of several seasons, Homelander started dismantling all of that. He killed Stillwell, he humiliated Edgar, he systematically removed everyone who had ever held power over him. And once he got what he always said he wanted, no constraints, no handlers, pure unfettered power, he didn't know what to do with it. He'd defined himself for so long in relation to the things limiting him that without those things, he became untethered in a way that's genuinely disturbing to watch. He still had his insecurities, he still had the emotional voids that all that corporate upbringing left in him. He still wanted to be loved in the deep, desperate way that people who have never been properly loved tend to want it. He just now had the capacity to demand it rather than earn it. Religion, then, is a logical next step. It's brilliant, actually, in the way the show has arrived at it. Because religion gives Homelander a framework where love and worship are not just possible, but theologically required. It's not enough for people to admire him. He wants them to need him. He wants to be the answer to something metaphysical. He wants to be the reason things are okay. And organized religion, specifically in the form it takes in a certain strain of American political life, offers exactly that. The Firecracker subplot is central to all of this. Firecracker, Valerie Curry's character, the far-right media personality who hosts the Truth Bomb TV show, has been the propaganda arm of Homelander's image management since Season 4. She frames him, she contextualizes him, she turns his worst impulses into a narrative that her audience finds not just acceptable, but righteous. In Season 5, that project extends into explicit religiosity. The Democratic Church of America is set up as a franchise, essentially, where local churches can operate under Homelander's banner, provided they pay their franchise fee and align their doctrine with his, which is, to be clear, gangsterism dressed up as theology. There's a scene in episode 5 where Firecracker meets with her old reverend, a man named Greg Dupree, whose church is being shaken down by a soup called Praying Mantis for exactly these franchise fees. Greg is terrified. He's seen what Firecracker has become, the audience she's cultivated, the line she's crossed between faith and political machinery, and he's despairing of it. But he's also hopeful, which is, in its way, more heartbreaking than if he'd just been defeated. He thinks there's still something of the person he raised spiritually inside her. He thinks she can pull back. He's wrong, as it turns out. She gets killed by Homelander in episode 5, impaled on an eagle statue for showing a moment of doubt, not even rebellion, just doubt. The Homelander Bible is one of the season's better gags. It's a document that combines the Old Testament, the New Testament, and AI-generated content to create a version of Scripture in which Homelander is the central figure. He wants to be not the second coming, he's very clear about this, but something better. Something that improves on the original, which tells you everything about the depth of his narcissism and the particular shape his theology takes. He doesn't want to be a servant of God. He wants to replace the concept. Eric Kripke has been explicit in interviews about what the show is targeting this season. He said pretty directly that Season 5 is taking a shot at Christian nationalism, this idea that Christianity, specifically in America, should require you to be supportive of violent and occasionally racist political policies. The irony he's pointing at is that those policies run directly counter to what Christianity actually teaches. And yet, there are politicians and public figures who invoke Jesus in support of positions that Jesus, by any reasonable reading of the Gospels, would have found appalling. The show is holding a funhouse mirror up to that contradiction. It's not subtle. The Boys has never been subtle. But there's something to be said for a show that knows exactly what it's doing and does it with full commitment. The satire here isn't just, look how bad this is. It's trying to trace the psychological and institutional mechanisms by which ordinary religious sentiment gets weaponized. How does someone like Firecracker, who has a genuine history with a genuine church and a genuine mentor, end up being the propaganda arm of a fascist? The show takes that question seriously, even as it presents the answer in the most outrageous possible way. Homelander's hallucinations of Madeline Stillwell are worth discussing here too, because they're doing something interesting in Season 5. Stillwell appears to him as an angelic figure, his angel, the show calls it, and she's guiding him toward this messianic self-conception, which is strange when you remember that in life Stillwell was a corporate executive who exploited his emotional dependence on her for Vaught's benefit. She wasn't a saint. She was very much not a saint. But in Homelander's fractured psychology, she's become something holy. She represents the love he never had and the approval he's always been chasing. And his brain has reconstructed her as divine, because that's the only category he has left for the things he can't control. There's a reading of Homelander's entire religious arc as a kind of grief process. He's grieving the version of himself that could have been loved normally. He's grieving Becca in a twisted way, the closest thing he ever had to genuine connection, gone because of his own violence. He's grieving whatever remained of the fantasy that people admire him rather than fear him. Religion, specifically the kind where you're the one being worshipped, means you never have to grieve anything again. It's an armor. The practical upshot of all this for Season 5's plot is that it creates a version of Homelander who is, if anything, more dangerous than the one we've seen before. Not because he's more powerful, though V1 might change that, and we'll get to that, but because he now has an institutional apparatus around his power. He's not just a violent man with superhuman abilities. He's a violent man with superhuman abilities, a propaganda network, a quasi-religious movement, a state apparatus, and the genuine belief that he's doing God's will. That combination is historically quite difficult to stop, which is, I suppose, exactly the point. One of the most satisfying things about Season 5's structure is that it has a very clear MacGuffin. Kripke used that word himself in an interview. He called V1 the MacGuffin of the final season, which is a pleasingly transparent piece of storytelling honesty. Everyone knows what a MacGuffin is. It's the thing everyone's chasing, the prize that drives the plot, and the show is quite comfortable telling you that's what's happening here. So, V1, what is it? Frederick Vought was a German scientist, a fictional one obviously, who collaborated with the Nazis in the show's backstory and then reinvented himself in America after the war, which is based fairly directly on the real Operation Paperclip, where the US government did actually recruit German scientists, some of them quite compromised ones, after World War II. Vought created the original compound Fev in the 1950s as part of a military program to create superpowered soldiers. Fort Harmony is the facility where this work happened. That original formula, V1, the first version, is chemically distinct from the compound V that's been used throughout the show. Importantly, it's distinct in a way that matters enormously for the Season 5 plot. The soup-killing virus that Butcher has been developing was created using regular compound V. It works on supes who have that version in their system, and it did, in fact, work on several Teenage Kicks members when tested in the early episodes of Season 5. The complication is Soldier Boy. When the virus hit Soldier Boy, it didn't kill him. He was clearly affected, it was doing something to him, but he survived. And the reason he survived is that his body contains V1, the original formula, which is apparently different enough from the standard compound V that the virus can't fully work on him. This creates the race that defines Season 5. Homelander's team, with Sister Sage's extraordinary intelligence driving the research, wants to get V1 into Homelander's blood, because if that works, he would become effectively immortal. The virus simply wouldn't touch him. Butcher's team wants the V1 for the opposite reason. If Dr. Samir Shah could use it to engineer a new, stronger virus, it might finally be capable of killing Homelander. The wrinkle, and it's a significant one, is that a V1-based virus would also kill every supe, regardless of how they came to have their powers. Kimiko was infected as a child, against her will. Starlight took Compound V as a teenager, as part of her Vought training. Ryan was literally born with his abilities. None of them chose this. All of them would die if Butcher's plan worked in its broadest form, and Butcher, at least through episode 4, was not especially troubled by this. He saw it as acceptable collateral damage in the mission to eliminate Homelander. The show is very deliberate in presenting this not as a difficult moral question Butcher is wrestling with, but as a line he's already crossed in his head. The destruction of the existing virus by Dr. Samir Shah is one of the season's more emotionally complicated moments. Shah is Zoe's father, Zoe being Victoria Newman's daughter, who Season 5 introduces as wanting Butcher dead for killing her mother. When Shah learns that Butcher killed Newman, who was the mother of his child's closest friend, he destroys the virus they'd all been working to develop. It's an act of grief as much as anything, and it makes the scramble for V1 all the more urgent, because now the Resistance doesn't just need V1 to improve the formula, they need it to rebuild it from scratch. The Fort Harmony section of episode 4 is particularly good because it connects the show's present to its distant past in a way that feels earned rather than just expository. This is where Frederick Vought's original experiments happened. This is where the first generation of American supes were made, in the early 1950s, as weapons for a government that had just watched what happened when a foreign power developed superhumans first. The horror there isn't just historical. The V1 that Soldier Boy carries is literally the substance that started all of this decades ago, and now it's the substance that might end it. The Russians are in the picture too, though their role is a bit more opaque. There are soldiers in the Season 5 trailer who are clearly a Russian contingent on some kind of mission in the United States. And episode 3 begins in Russia, with Ryan wiping out a CIA Special Forces squad with disturbing ease. What Moscow knows about V1, whether they've been running their own version of the program, whether they become a factor in the endgame, all of that is still unresolved at the midpoint of the season. But the show has returned to the Russia thread enough times, going back to the Vought Tower raid plotline and the whole Soldier Boy backstory involving the Soviet program that captured him, that it feels safe to assume it's not a loose thread. They're going to pull it somewhere. The moral stakes of V1 as a narrative device are interesting because they force every character into a position on a question the show has been dancing around for a while. Is a world without supes actually better? And who gets to make that call? Mother's Milk has been the voice of, we can't commit genocide, even against supes, since this version of the plan emerged. Frenchie and Kimiko have the most personal stake in the answer. Her existence is what makes the abstract discussion concrete. Annie is in the position of fighting alongside Butcher, while knowing that his purest version of victory means her death. The show doesn't resolve this cleanly in the first 5 episodes, and I'd be surprised if it does cleanly in the last 3. What it will probably do is force a choice that costs someone something irreplaceable. That's what The Boys does. It doesn't let people have clean victories. It makes them pay for the versions of winning they're actually willing to accept. And V1 is the clearest possible representation of that. The thing that could end Homelander is the same thing that could kill everyone the boys are actually fighting for. The question the show has been building toward for at least 2 seasons, and which Season 5 is now asking openly, is whether Billy Butcher is going to end the series as a villain. And I think the answer is yes, or at least yes in some form. The details are still playing out, but the direction has been unmistakable for a while. Let's start with Joe Kessler, because Kessler is central to understanding where Butcher is psychologically in Season 5. Kessler, played by Jeffrey Dean Morgan in one of the show's better casting decisions, was introduced in Season 4 as a former CIA contact of Butcher's, someone from his past who represented the ruthless pragmatism that Butcher had always flirted with, but kept at arm's length. Except Kessler wasn't real. He was a hallucination, a projection of the part of Butcher's psyche that had fully committed to by any means necessary. And in the Season 4 finale, Butcher chose Kessler. He looked in the mirror and he chose the version of himself that doesn't flinch. That choice is the engine of Season 5. Butcher is operating at the end of Season 4 and the beginning of Season 5 without the emotional breaks that used to slow him down. He's dying, the tumour isn't gone, and the compound V in his system is still doing its damage. And he has decided that since he's dying anyway, he might as well use what's left to finish the job. The tentacles that emerged from his chest in the Season 4 finale are still there. He has powers now, however unstable, and he's using them. Huey tells him in episode 4 that he's becoming Homelander. It's the line the show has been setting up for seasons, the mirror between Butcher and Homelander, two men defined entirely by their hatred and their inability to move past specific wounds. Homelander lost Stillwell, Butcher lost Becca, and both of them responded by building an identity around that loss, rather than grieving through it. The difference, theoretically, is that Butcher has always had a moral line somewhere. He's always had people he was protecting, a reason behind the violence that was something other than ego. But in Season 5, that line keeps moving. He was willing, in episodes 2 and 3, to use Ryan as bait to lure Homelander into a situation where the virus could kill both of them. Ryan, the kid he promised Becca he'd protect, the one person he explicitly took responsibility for. And Butcher was willing to let him die in service of the mission. When you compare that to where Butcher was in Season 1, reluctant, complicated, capable of genuine feeling, it's a remarkable character deterioration, or development, depending on how you look at it. What the show is drawing is a picture of how good intentions corrupt. Butcher started with a legitimate grievance. Homelander genuinely did terrible things. Vought genuinely is monstrous. The world is genuinely worse for the existence of unaccountable corporate superpower. That's all still true. But the question the show has always been asking is whether righteous ends justify terrible means. And by Season 5, Butcher has stopped asking the question at all. He's at the point where the means are the only thing left. The comics comparison is unavoidable here. In Garth Ennis's original story, Butcher's arc ends with him going full rogue after Homelander is dead. He starts killing everyone with any trace of Compound V in their system, which includes his own team. He kills Mother's Milk in a brutal fight. He detonates a bomb that kills Frenchie and Kimiko. He kills other people in their orbit. He becomes, in the purest sense, what he always accused Supes of being, someone who decided that his judgment was more important than everyone else's right to exist. Huey is the one who ultimately stops him, and both of them die. The show has been diverging from the comics throughout its run. The original Black Noir's role, Homelander's characterization, Victoria Newman's entire existence, so it's not certain that it goes down the same route, but the trajectory it's built for Butcher in Seasons 4 and 5 is pointing very clearly in that direction. The leaked plot details that have been circulating suggest that something like this does happen. Butcher injects Soldier Boy with the virus, which causes Soldier Boy to explode, and in the aftermath, the Kessler persona within Butcher takes over more completely and starts hunting down remaining Supes. Homelander is reportedly killed by Butcher during this sequence, but then Butcher becomes the threat, and it's Huey who has to stop him. If that's the shape of it, then the season finale is really Huey's story, as much as anyone's. And given that the show started with Huey, a normal bloke in a record shop, no powers, no training, just loss and a kind of stubborn decency, it would be a satisfying full circle to have it end with him. Him being the one who stops not Homelander, but Butcher. Him being the thing that stands between his best friend and the worst version of himself. The episode 5 moment with Terra, Butcher's bulldog, is worth understanding in this context. Terra gets into some chocolate that Frenchie had left around, which is of course toxic to dogs, and Butcher's immediate panic is about saving the dog. He and Huey work together to help Terra, and it produces this brief tender moment between them that the show hasn't really had for a while. Butcher lets down his guard. He lets Huey see that there's still something in there that cares about something, and after that moment, he agrees that if they find V1, they'll make sure Annie and Kimiko can take some. They won't be collateral damage. It's a small thing. It's deliberately a small thing. And several critics have pointed out fairly that it's a bit weird that it took a dog eating chocolate to restore Butcher's humanity when things like Ryan being beaten half to death by Homelander didn't quite manage it. The show is aware that it's a slightly odd narrative turn, but it's also very deliberate about using it as a "but this glimpse of humanity likely won't win out in the end" moment, rather than a full redemption. Butcher is still planning genocide against supes. He's just slightly more willing to carve out exceptions for the people he loves, which doesn't actually change the moral calculus much, and the show knows that. The tumour and what it represents keeps coming back as the metaphor the series can't let go of. Butcher's cancer is his hatred given physical form. His powers are his capacity for violence, made literal. And the question of whether he survives Season 5 is inseparable from the question of whether someone like Butcher deserves to survive, whether the show is willing to make that argument. My instinct is that it isn't. The show has always been too honest about its characters to give Butcher a clean exit. Whatever happens, he's the most tragic figure in the series, more tragic than Homelander, who was always going to be what he became. Butcher chose this. Jensen Ackles as a soldier boy is one of those casting choices that seemed like it might be stunt casting when it was first announced. Dean Winchester, from Supernatural, playing a deconstructed Captain America figure, and then turned out to be rather good. Ackles brings a particular kind of swaggering, fragile, entirely self-unaware masculinity to the role that fits perfectly with what the show is doing. Soldier Boy isn't just a bad person. He's a specific kind of bad person. The kind who has never had to examine himself because the world always arranged itself to tell him he was great. His history is one of the show's more densely layered backstories. He was the first major superhero created by Vaught's American program, made in the 1950s using Frederick Vaught's original V1 formula. He was deployed as a propaganda tool during the Cold War, presented as the quintessential American hero, and somewhere in that process became genuinely monstrous in ways that Vought found useful as long as they could control them. He was eventually captured by the Soviets, who Vought quietly handed him over to, and spent decades in cryosleep in Russia while his reputation was kept alive as a missing hero. When he came back in Season 3, the show did something interesting. It didn't rehabilitate him. He's awful. He's casually bigoted, emotionally stunted in the specific way that powerful men who've never been told no tend to be, and he has a habit of doing catastrophic violence without much apparent remorse. He also has a power set that's distinct from Homelander's. His is more explosive, more nuclear, able to depower other supes when it connects. Which is why he was briefly useful in Season 3 as a potential weapon against Homelander before the whole plan collapsed. What Season 5 has done with him is put him in the one situation he didn't expect, being actually fathered by Homelander. Or, more accurately, being the father of someone who has completely surpassed him. Homelander is, by any measure, more powerful than Soldier Boy. Younger, stronger, faster, with a wider range of abilities. And Homelander woke Soldier Boy from his cryosleep not because he needed him specifically, but because he wanted a father figure. And then almost immediately sent Soldier Boy after Butcher as a test Soldier Boy nearly failed, courtesy of the virus. The fact that Soldier Boy survived the virus is what reshapes the whole season's dynamic. He sat up in the body bag, like some kind of 1950s-era superhero/a villain, and now the question of whose side he's actually on becomes complicated. He was sent to his potential death by his son. He almost died, he knows this. But based on episodes 4 and 5, he's still operating within Homelander's orbit, accompanying him to Fort Harmony, nominally obeying, which suggests either genuine loyalty, which seems implausible given what just happened, or a pragmatic decision to play along until the moment is right. Kripke said in an interview before Season 5 that there's a lot of good father-son emotion between him and Homelander that we never really got to play. And that's true. The Season 3 dynamic between them was cut short by the collapse of the Alliance. What Season 5 seems to be giving them is a longer exploration of that relationship, with all its toxicity and complexity. Two men who are both deeply damaged by the specific ways they were created and used. Two men who are, in different ways, incapable of genuine connection. Watching them try to have a father-son relationship is one of the more uncomfortable things the show has produced, and that's saying something. The firecracker soldier boy romantic subplot is the season's most unambiguously silly thread, and I think it knows that. They end up sleeping together because, apparently, mutual chaos is attractive. Homelander discovers this because he can literally smell it, which is the kind of detail that only this show would deploy. His reaction, petty jealousy, rather than the more rational response of, "This is useful information about my asset," tells you a lot about how deeply personal everything still is for him. He doesn't process threats rationally. He processes them emotionally, and then acts out. Now, there's a character in Season 5 called Bombsight, Mason Dye in the role, who has a bitter history with Soldier Boy. The show hasn't fully explained what that history is, but he apparently has some kind of explosive or telekinetic powers, and he's suggested to be very old, which implies either he's another V1 recipient from the original program, or he's someone who's encountered Soldier Boy across a span of decades. Either way, he clearly has unfinished business, and the show doesn't introduce that kind of detail without intending to resolve it. The theory about Soldier Boy's role in the finale, and it's a theory that feels more like a prediction, given how carefully the season has been setting it up, involves him being the delivery mechanism for the virus against Homelander. Butcher injects Soldier Boy with an enhanced version. Soldier Boy explodes in the way we know he can. The explosion affects everyone in range, including Homelander and Sister Sage, stripping or significantly reducing their powers. And in that window of vulnerability, Butcher kills Homelander. If that's how it goes, it's a fittingly cruel ending for Soldier Boy. He ends up being used as a weapon again. Not by a government or a corporation this time, but by Butcher, who is by this point in the show essentially his own worst enemy given a more compelling coat of paint. Soldier Boy, who spent decades being a weapon for Vought, dies being a weapon for the Resistance, which doesn't quite make it heroic. It makes it efficient. This show doesn't really do heroic. It does cost, and the supernatural reunion element, Jared Padalecki and Misha Collins both appearing in Season 5, with Kripke confirming they're in the same frame together with Ackles, is the show doing something kind for the fan base that grew up on Supernatural. A gift to people who watched Jensen Ackles for 15 years before The Boys. It doesn't change the weight of what's happening, but it's a generous moment in the middle of what is otherwise a fairly grim final season. Kripke has always understood that television is partly about community, and he's acknowledging the community that got him here. Ryan Butcher is in some ways the show's most interesting character to track across the full run, and I say that knowing that the show has Homelander and Billy Butcher and Starlight and several others with significantly more screen time. But Ryan represents something specific, the question of whether someone created by terrible circumstances and surrounded by terrible influences can choose differently. He was born of Homelander raping Becca. He grew up hidden from his biological father, with his mother doing everything possible to give him a normal life. He met Butcher, he lost Becca, he eventually met Homelander. And from that point on, his story has been about which of those two adults gets to define him. The one who represents violence in service of a stated moral purpose, and the one who represents violence in service of absolute ego. Neither of them is a good option. Neither of them has treated him as a person rather than an object in their war. At the end of Season 4, Ryan was in an ambiguous position. He'd accidentally killed Grace Mallory, Homelander had manipulated him, and Butcher had decided that Ryan was, as he put it, too much like his father. That last part is the most devastating. Butcher looked at a traumatized teenager and saw Homelander and rejected him on that basis. Whatever relationship they'd built, and it had been real in its way, was apparently conditional on Ryan not reminding Butcher of the thing he hated most. Season 5 catches up with Ryan in Russia, of all places, where he's apparently been hiding and is killing CIA operatives with an unsettling ease. The opening scene of episode 3 shows him wiping out an entire squad, and the camera doesn't flinch from it. He's not doing it reluctantly, he's not doing it with obvious anguish, he's doing it because he can and because they were there, which is deeply worrying. When he comes back into Butcher's orbit, contacted by Butcher, who wants to use him as bait to lure Homelander into a situation where the virus can hit both of them, Ryan's initial willingness is partly understandable. Butcher tells him what Homelander did to his mother, and Ryan's response is rage. He goes to confront Homelander directly, which Butcher explicitly told him not to do, and the fight that follows is one of the most physically hard-to-watch scenes the show has done. Not because it's exceptionally gory, by the boys' standards it's not, but because you're watching a child try to fight the person who hurt his mother and fail completely. Homelander doesn't even seem angry about it. He beats Ryan with a kind of bored contempt, stops before the killing blow and leaves. Ryan is found barely breathing by Butcher, and the detail that the show is careful to include, that Butcher checks on him, that there's a visible breath, matters, because Ryan clearly still has a role to play. The theory that Ryan ultimately kills Homelander has been circulating since season 2, and it hasn't gone away, and I think for good reason. It's the most symbolically loaded version of that event, the son undoing the father, the thing Homelander created being the thing that destroys him. There's a shape to it that feels right for this show's aesthetic, but the complication, and this is what I find most interesting about Ryan's arc, is the moral cost of it. If Ryan kills Homelander, what does that do to Ryan? He's already showing signs of the kind of dissociation that comes from surviving sustained trauma and having no one in your life who's treating you as a child rather than a chess piece. Butcher used him. Homelander is trying to use him. The CIA apparently tried to use him, hence the squad he killed in Russia. Every adult in Ryan's life has looked at his power and thought about what they can get from it. What the show needs to do with Ryan in the final 3 episodes is give him something that isn't defined by what other people need from him. His arc has to be about choice, real choice, not just choosing which adult to obey. The most satisfying version of his story would involve him refusing to be used at all, finding some third option that neither Butcher nor Homelander offered him. Whether that's possible in the space the show has left is the question. 3 episodes isn't much runway for the resolution of a character's entire psychological journey, but the show has been building this for long enough that it has the material. And Cameron Crovetti's performance across these seasons has been genuinely affecting in a way that not all child actors manage. He's made Ryan's confusion and pain feel real rather than performed. There's one more angle on Ryan that's worth sitting with for a moment, which is what his existence means for the show's broader argument about inherited evil. Homelander is, in some ways, a product of his creation. He was made monstrous by the conditions of his upbringing. Ryan was also made under traumatic conditions, but the show has consistently presented Ryan as someone with genuine moral instincts, someone who hesitates where Homelander doesn't. He didn't choose to kill Grace Mallory. He's torn about the things he's done. That moral texture is what separates him from his biological father, and it's what makes his story matter. The question is whether those instincts survive what's coming. 3 more episodes of being used as a weapon, losing people, and watching the world he's caught in destroy itself. Will there be enough of Ryan left at the end to be Ryan, or just whatever the war made of him? I genuinely don't know. And in a show that's running down its last few hours, not knowing is probably the most honest thing I can say. There's a question at the heart of season 5 that the show is too smart to pretend has a clean answer. And it's this: if you could eliminate every superhuman on Earth, should you? Butcher's answer is yes. His reasoning is that supes are, by their nature, a threat. Not all supes are Homelander. The show knows this and presents it clearly, but the structural problem of a class of beings with capabilities that make accountability functionally impossible is one that Butcher believes can only be solved by removing that class entirely. He sees it the way a certain kind of radical sees systemic problems. You don't reform the system, you remove its ability to function. Mother's Milk's answer is no, and not primarily for philosophical reasons. It's personal. The soup-killing virus would kill Kimiko, who is his friend, who was given Compound V as a child in circumstances she had no control over and no say in. It would kill Starlight, who took it as a teenager as part of Vought's program. It would kill Ryan, who was born with it. Mother's Milk's position is that you don't punish people for the circumstances of their creation. That's a moral intuition most people would agree with in the abstract. The show's genius is that it won't let either position be simply right. Butcher's position is correct in one sense. Vought's problem isn't Homelander specifically, it's the structural reality of unaccountable superhuman power. Remove Homelander and another one eventually emerges, because the machine that produces them is still running. If the virus worked cleanly and completely, it would solve the problem in a way that arresting Homelander or even killing him wouldn't. There's a cold logic to it that the show takes seriously rather than dismissing. Mother's Milk's position is correct in a different sense. Collective punishment is wrong. Full stop. Kimiko didn't hurt anyone. Starlight has been fighting against Vought for years. Ryan is a child. The fact that they share a biological characteristic with people who have done terrible things doesn't make them responsible for those things. And the willingness to kill innocents in service of a perceived greater good is precisely the logic that the show has been criticizing in Homelander from the beginning. The moment Butcher uses that logic, he's adopted the framework of the thing he's fighting. What makes this genuinely uncomfortable in Season 5 is that the show isn't presenting it as a hypothetical. It's playing out in real time. Butcher was, through Episode 4, actively planning to use the virus in a way that would kill Kimiko and Starlight. He was treating their lives as acceptable losses, and the Episode 5 moment where he agrees to try to protect them, contingent on finding V1 to give them immunity, is framed carefully. He's not converting to Mother's Milk's moral position. He's making a pragmatic concession because Huey convinced him it was possible. The underlying calculation hasn't changed. If it came down to killing Kimiko to kill Homelander, based on what we've seen of Butcher this season, it's not clear he'd choose differently. The show's history with this question goes back to Season 1, where the original premise was Butcher wanting to expose Compound V and bring down Vought. The virus plan represents how far that mission has evolved or corroded depending on your perspective. From expose the truth to kill everyone with any trace of this substance in their blood is a significant escalation, and the show traces the steps of that escalation with enough care that it feels earned rather than sudden. One of the things that makes the virus question particularly interesting is the issue of consent and context. Kimiko was infected, Ryan was born, Starlight was trained, the Deep was recruited. These are different categories of soup with very different relationships to their powers. The virus doesn't distinguish between them. It can't. It doesn't know who chose and who didn't, who was victimized and who was complicit. It just kills anything with Compound V in the blood. And a moral framework that can't distinguish between victims and perpetrators is not a moral framework at all. It's just violence with extra justification. The theory about how the virus actually gets used in the finale, the targeted approach, Soldier Boy as delivery mechanism, affecting Homelander in a moment of physical vulnerability rather than as a blanket genocide, is satisfying precisely because it sidesteps the full horror of Butcher's plan. Whether the show gives him that out, or whether it makes him face the full consequences of what he was planning, is one of the things I'm most curious about. Because the show has always been interested in consequences, it doesn't let characters escape what they've done. And Butcher spending 2 seasons planning the deaths of innocent people, including people he specifically promised to protect, is not the kind of thing that gets quietly filed away. What happens in the last 3 episodes to the world after the virus question is resolved, in whatever form it is also worth thinking about. If some version of the plan works and Homelander is dead, and there are significantly fewer supes in the world, what then? Vought is still a corporation. The freedom camps existed, the propaganda networks were built, the political machinery that allowed one person to seize this much power was in place. None of that disappears because Homelander does. The show has always been more interested in systems than in individuals. The individual villain is almost a distraction from the institutional argument it's making. And whatever version of the ending we get, I'd be surprised if it offered the satisfaction of a world fully healed. More likely, a world that has survived something terrible and is now going to spend a long time figuring out what it did to itself. Annie January has had arguably the most straightforward, heroic arc in the show, which isn't to say it's been simple. She's been manipulated, betrayed, nearly killed multiple times, and has had to repeatedly make the choice to keep going when giving up would have been completely understandable. But her compass has never really wavered. She's known what was right from the beginning, and the show has been honest about how much it costs to always know what's right and keep acting on it anyway. She started as a small-town girl who made it into the Seven and quickly discovered that the organisation she'd idolised was rotten from the top down. She started as Homelander's newest asset. She became his most publicly visible opponent. And now, in Season 5, she's one of the faces of the Resistance, out in the open, visibly identified as the enemy of the regime, which puts a target on her back that hasn't gotten any smaller as the season has progressed. Her powers have always been interesting. The light manipulation, the ability to absorb and release electricity and light, is one of the show's more visually striking power sets. It's also one that's grown across the series, not just in scale, but in the way Annie uses it. She started out using it defensively, almost reluctantly. By Season 5, she's using it with the full confidence of someone who has accepted that this is part of who she is, and she's going to use it to do as much good as possible for as long as she's able. The Annie-Hughie relationship is the show's central love story, and it's one of the things The Boys has handled well. They're a genuinely functional couple, which is rare in prestige television, and the show has avoided the trap of manufacturing artificial drama between them. Their conflicts have been about real things, Hughie's insecurity about being the only non-supe in a world full of supes, Annie's frustration at being held back from decisions, the weight of what they've both been through, and they keep choosing each other. Through all of it, A-Train's death in episode 1 is worth talking about in the Starlight section because his relationship with Annie across the show has been one of its more unexpectedly rich threads. He was the one who showed her the Flight 37 footage back in Season 1. He was the one who started the chain of events that led to everything, and he spent most of the series being deeply self-serving about it, helping sometimes, backing away at others, generally operating as a man trying to be in 2 camps at once, because committing fully to either was too frightening. His final episode is the show's most complete version of A-Train as a person. He reconciles with his brother, he finds out that his mother is proud of him, he runs scared from Homelander, because Homelander killed his friend, and he's been running scared since the end of Season 4, and then he stops, he stands his ground, he leads Homelander away from the group to protect them, and he doesn't quite survive it, he trips at the end, the same thing that's defined him from the very beginning. The very first scene, when he ran through Robin and killed her, he trips, and Homelander kills him. Kripke said in an interview that they initially planned to keep A-Train around, until episode 3 or so, and that they ended up telling his story in a compressed but satisfying way. He's right. It is satisfying. And the detail that he dodges a woman at the last second, choosing not to hurt her, the opposite of what happened with Robin, is the clearest possible signal that he actually changed, that the arc was real. The Gen V connection is one of Season 5's more interesting structural choices. The show set up its spin-off, Gen V, following the students of Vought Superhero University, and made the decision to have those characters cross over into the final season of the main show. Marie Moreau and her blood manipulation powers, Jordan Lee, Emma Meyer, Sam, Kate, they all join the resistance. This is the Vought system cannibalizing itself in a way. The students it trained to be the next generation of corporate heroes are now fighting against the institution. Marie's specific power is interesting in this context. She can control blood, her own and others. It's a viscerally offensive power, the kind that makes you wince when you see it, but it's also been framed as something genuinely extraordinary. She was supposedly powerful enough to pose a real threat to Homelander in Gen V. Whether that pays off in The Boys Season 5 proper remains to be seen, but the show has invested in her enough that she'll have a meaningful role. The question of what Starlight's story needs to resolve in the finale is one I keep coming back to. She's been the moral centre of the show since Season 1. She's been the voice saying, "This is wrong," in rooms full of people deciding to do the wrong thing. In the world after Homelander, if there is a world after Homelander, if the show gives them that, Annie is the person best positioned to help rebuild something. She has public recognition, genuine moral credibility, and unlike almost everyone else in the main cast, she's managed to get through 4.5 seasons without fundamentally betraying herself. Whether the show gives her that future, or whether it makes her pay the same kind of price everyone else pays, is one of the things I'm quietly dreading. She deserves a good ending. Whether deserving something is enough in The Boys is a different question entirely. Now let's talk about some of the characters who don't necessarily get their names on the poster, but who have become, over 5 seasons, as essential to the show as anyone. Because The Boys has always been good at this, at taking what could have been background colour and making it something you actually care about. Mother's Milk Marvin, Mother's Milk, has functioned as the show's moral compass in a specific way that's different from Starlight. Annie's moral clarity comes from who she is. She was raised with values. She has a fundamental decency that feels almost constitutional. MM's moral position is more hard-won. He's someone who knows exactly what he's capable of, has seen himself at his worst, and has to choose every day not to go there. His backstory, the OCD that gets worse under stress, the family he's trying to protect, the specific history with Soldier Boy that became personal in Season 3, has given him a depth that could easily have been absent from a character who in less careful hands might have been just the responsible one. The thing about MM is that he's not just responsible, he's right. When he says they've gone too far, he's usually correct. And when he gets ignored, things get worse. Season 5 puts him in the position of processing his father's death at Homelander's hands, a killing that happened to MM's father because of his association with the Resistance. That's a specific kind of grief, the knowledge that someone you love died because of choices you made. And the show doesn't rush him through it, it lets it sit. He keeps going, because he has to, but you see him carrying it. If the leaked information about MM's fate is accurate, he doesn't make it to the end. That would be a significant loss, not just in terms of the character's value to the show, but in terms of what it would mean for the group. MM is the person who keeps asking whether they're still the good guys. Without that voice, things get darker faster. Frenchie and Kimiko, Frenchie and Kimiko. The show's love story that took 4 seasons to properly become a love story, and which arrived at that point through shared trauma and genuine tenderness, rather than the usual dramatic machinery. Frenchie has always been the show's most human character in a specific sense. He's the one most interested in being a person rather than a soldier. He has a past he's ashamed of, his involvement with a gang that led to deaths he's haunted by, and his relationship with Kimiko has been, among other things, a project of mutual redemption. They've been good for each other. They've made each other better. Kimiko's development over the series has been remarkable in its restraint. She started largely non-verbal, not because she couldn't speak, but because the trauma of her captivity and experimentation had taken that from her, and the show used her silence as an expressive instrument in ways that not many shows would have the patience for. Her speaking her first word at the end of season 4 felt genuinely earned because of how long and carefully the show had gotten there. Season 5 has them in the aftermath of their imprisonment, and the dynamic between them has shifted slightly. There's more directness to Kimiko, more openness, now that the silence has broken. Frenchie is, as always, performing emotional availability even when he's clearly holding something difficult. They're very good together. The theory that neither of them survives the finale is one of the more painful things I've come across in my research for this video. It's consistent with the show's history of making you care very much about something and then taking it away, and it would represent the kind of devastating loss that Kripke has promised. I hope it's wrong. The Deep Kevin, the Deep, is one of the more complicated achievements of the show. He started as a rapist and a bully, presented in the first episode doing something unambiguously awful, and then spending the rest of the series in a kind of extended humiliation arc that the show played partly for laughs, which was uncomfortable because you're laughing at someone who did a terrible thing, but not for the reason you'd want to laugh at a rapist. What the show gradually revealed was a man whose entire identity was constructed around being a superhero and being desirable, who had absolutely nothing underneath that construction. The gills, the octopus, the desperate need for Homelander's approval, the way he leaps back into Homelander's orbit whenever he sees an opening. It's all the behaviour of someone who has never developed an internal life and doesn't know how to start. Season 5 has him still in Homelander's service, still performing loyalty, still being the butt of jokes about his aquatic relationships. Whether he gets anything approaching an ending that acknowledges the complexity of his journey, rather than just dying pathetically, which also seems possible, is unclear. I'd like the show to give him one genuine moment of clarity. It probably won't, but I'd like it to. Sister Sage Susan Hayward Sage, introduced in Season 4 as the smartest human being alive, recruited by Homelander to be his strategic advisor, has been one of the season's most interesting additions. The detail that she regularly performs a medical procedure on herself to temporarily lobotomize herself, because the weight of being that intelligent is exhausting, is one of the show's stranger and more haunting inventions. Her role in Season 5 is as Homelander's research arm for the V1 project, and she's been consistently one step ahead of everyone else throughout. If the theory about Soldier Boy's explosion stripping her powers alongside Homelander's is correct, her death would follow from that depowering. Butcher kills her while she's vulnerable, apparently, which is a purposefully unglamorous end for the show's smartest character, Ashley Barrett. And then there's Ashley, who has been one of my favourite elements of Season 5 so far. She took Compound V at the end of Season 4 in what seemed like a desperate survival move. She was clearly terrified of being killed by Homelander's purge of Vought's internal opposition. In Season 5, the effects of that become clear. She's developed some form of mind-reading ability. Her head is enlarged in that Vought body horror way, and she's using both to quietly assist the resistance while publicly serving as Homelander's press secretary. The Ashley story is the show's most pointed argument about how authoritarian systems actually maintain themselves. It's not through committed believers, or not only through them, it's through people like Ashley, who are neither entirely complicit nor entirely resistant, who make small compromises for survival that accumulate into large ones, and who occasionally find a way to do something decent inside the constraints they've built around themselves. She's not a hero, she's not a villain. She's a person trying to survive in a system that was designed to make surviving require moral compromise, which is, the show argues, exactly how these systems work. Right, so, the comics. Let's talk about the source material, because it matters for understanding where the show might be heading, even if the show has been diverging from the comics so aggressively and so consistently that direct comparisons have their limits. Garth Ennis and Derek Robertson's original Boys comics ran from 2006 to 2012, and they are, even more than the show, committed to a vision of superhero fiction as a vehicle for political satire and unsparing character study. Ennis has strong opinions about superhero comics generally and isn't shy about expressing them. The comics are darker than the show in some ways, more willing to be graphically unpleasant and less interested in making characters sympathetic. Homelander in the comics is almost a pure monster. The show's Anthony Starr version is more complicated, more pitiable, and for that reason, arguably more unsettling. The comic's ending involves several things that the show has made impossible, complicated, or already resolved differently. The most significant is Black Noir. In the comics, Black Noir was created by Vought as a secret clone of Homelander, literally a version of Homelander, genetically identical, designed as a failsafe to kill the original if he ever went rogue. Black Noir was the one who committed various atrocities throughout the comics that were attributed to Homelander, feeding on humans, assaulting Becca, which is how the comics handled the question of whether Homelander was truly monstrous or just dangerously unstable. He was both, but he hadn't done everything he was accused of. The show can't do this. The show killed its version of Black Noir in Season 3. Homelander discovers that Black Noir knew the truth about his creation and had been concealing it, and kills him for it, then replaces him with an actor. So the entire Black Noir's secret weapon element of the comics is gone, which means the show has to find a different mechanism for Homelander's death. The comics version of Butcher's ending is the blueprint the show seems to be following most closely. Despite all the other divergences, after Homelander is dealt with, Comics Butcher turns on his own team. He kills Mother's Milk, detonates a bomb that kills Frenchie and Kimiko, eliminates several other people in their orbit, and is ultimately stopped by Huey. Both of them die. The show, as we discussed in the Butcher section, seems to be tracking towards something similar in structure, the Kessler persona taking over, the hunt for remaining supes, Huey being the one to stop him. What the show has added to this compared to the comics is a genuine interiority for all the characters involved. Comics Butcher's rampage is horrible, but not particularly surprising. The comics are fairly explicit about what Butcher is capable of. Show Butcher has been presented with enough complexity and enough genuine feeling that his descent into this is genuinely sad rather than just horrifying. The show has earned the weight of that ending in a way the comics didn't need to, because Comics Butcher was never as sympathetic to begin with. The Huey ending in the comics is bittersweet in a specific way. He survives, Starlight survives, they're the only two, and Huey is left with the knowledge of what his friends were, and what they became, which is its own kind of ruin. The show's Huey has followed a different arc, more capable, more willing to engage with the ugliness of what they do, but fundamentally still the person we met in the first episode, still the moral imagination of the group. Whether he survives and whether Annie is with him if he does are two of the questions I'm most invested in. The one element from the comics I find myself wanting the show to use that it probably won't, purely because it's been logistically foreclosed, is the Black Noir reveal. The idea of a secret clone, of the worst things attributed to your villain being the work of a failsafe planted next to him, has a kind of conceptual elegance that the Homelander as pure product of his upbringing version of the character doesn't quite replicate. The show's Homelander doesn't need a clone to be genuinely monstrous. He's genuinely monstrous on his own. But there was something about the Black Noir reveal in the comics that reframed everything that had come before it. And that kind of structural reframing is one of the things prestige television tends to go for in final seasons. The show might have its own version of that reframing in store. The Oh Father reveal, Davy digs in a character whose nature wasn't made public until March 2026, very close to the premiere, might be doing something in that territory. The show has been careful about what it's revealed about that character, which usually means it's significant. What Oh Father represents in the show's final theological argument is something I'm still trying to figure out. One thing worth appreciating about the comics to show adaptation is how thoughtfully Eric Kripke has handled the adaptation's relationship to its source material. He's used it as a foundation rather than a blueprint. He's kept the core themes, the political satire, the deconstruction of heroism, the argument that power corrupts in direct proportion to how unaccountable it is, while building characters who are legible and emotionally resonant in ways that comics characters sometimes aren't. It's a genuinely successful adaptation, which is rarer than it should be. The finale is called Blood and Bone. That title comes from a line Homelander said to Butcher in Season 3 when he promised that if Butcher ever came for him, it would end in blood and bone, one way or another. The show titling the finale with that phrase is a promise. Whatever else happens in those last few episodes, Homelander and Butcher are going to their conclusion in the manner the show has always suggested they would. One way or another, it's the central question of 5 seasons of television. How do you stop a man who is functionally invulnerable, who can fly, who can see through walls, who has enough power in his eyes to destroy buildings, and who now has a state apparatus and a religious movement backing him up? The show has been playing a long game with this. Every season has offered something that looks like it might be the answer. Compound V exposure in Season 1, Soldier Boy in Season 3, Victoria Newman's head-popping powers, the virus, and every time the answer turned out to be incomplete. Not because the show was stalling, but because it was being honest about how difficult it actually is to remove entrenched power. The material answer isn't usually the hard part. The structural conditions that allow something like Homelander to exist are, but let's go through the theories. The Ryan version has the most thematic resonance. Ryan has the same power set as Homelander, and while he's currently nowhere near his father's level, he's young, he's developing, and he has a specific emotional drive that might, at the right moment, produce something extraordinary. The Star Wars parallel is obvious: the son redeeming or destroying the father, the next generation either continuing or breaking the cycle, and the show has been setting up that parallel carefully enough that it feels intentional rather than coincidental. If Ryan kills Homelander, it completes a specific kind of story about inherited legacy and whether the sins of the parent can be answered by the child. The counter-argument is about what it does to Ryan. He's 14 or 15 at this point. If he kills his biological father, even a father who beat him half to death, that's an enormous psychological weight to carry forward. The show might decide that Ryan killing Homelander is exactly the kind of thing it should refuse to do, because it protects Ryan from being defined by the worst moment of his life. That would also be a kind of thematic statement. The Butcher version is what the leaked information suggests actually happens, at least in terms of who delivers the final blow. Soldier Boy is injected with the enhanced virus, explodes, and the explosion strips or significantly reduces Homelander's powers in the aftermath, leaving him vulnerable, and Butcher kills him while he's in that vulnerable state. This is interesting because it's not a fair fight. It's not a climactic battle between equals. It's Butcher, dying, using every available tool to make sure the job gets done, which is very much in keeping with how Butcher has always operated. He doesn't fight fair, he fights to win. The question of whether that constitutes a satisfying ending for Homelander, whether a depowered, vulnerable death feels proportionate to everything he's done, is one the show will have to answer in the moment of it. The psychological collapse version is a theory that doesn't require anyone to land a particular blow. Homelander's mental state has been deteriorating throughout the series. The hallucinations, the Madeline Stillwell visions, the Messiah delusions, the fragility under every display of dominance. These are the psychological profile of someone moving towards some kind of fracture. Some fans have speculated that Homelander destroys himself essentially, that his grip on reality becomes loose enough that his own power turns against him somehow, or that he commits an act so extreme that even his most loyal followers turn away, leaving him truly alone for the first time. I find this less likely than the others, but it's not impossible. The show has always been interested in Homelander's psychology as the real engine of the story, and an ending that was purely internal rather than physical would be consistent with that interest. The systemic approach is the most honest answer to how do you stop Homelander, even if it's not a satisfying action sequence answer. You destroy the machine that created him and protects him. Vought falls, the propaganda network collapses, the political apparatus that gave him the state's legitimacy is dismantled, and he's left as what he always was underneath all of that, a terrified, lonely, emotionally stunted person with destructive powers and no idea what to do with them. Some fans think the show ends with Homelander not killed, but isolated, stripped of his support structure, left to whatever version of existence is available to him when there's no one left to perform for. I don't think that happens. The show has been too clear about the personal dimension of the Butcher-Homelander confrontation, too specific about the blood and bone promise to resolve things without physical confrontation. But the systemic dimension will be part of what makes the ending mean something, rather than just end something. The V1 immortality complication is the most recent wrinkle in all of this, and it's the most direct narrative threat to any of the above theories. If Homelander gets V1 into his bloodstream, which Sister Sage has been working on, and which Homelander has been pursuing through his access to Soldier Boy and to Fort Harmony, he becomes immune to the virus. The physical mechanism that Butcher has been building his entire plan around becomes useless. The race to get there first isn't just a plot device, it's the thing that determines whether any of the theories above are even possible. Based on where Episode 5 leaves things, the Resistance is behind. They lost the existing virus when Shah destroyed it. They don't have V1. Homelander is working with Sister Sage to secure it. Whoever gets there first shapes everything that comes after. And right now, Homelander has the advantage. This is a fun one, and I think it deserves its own section rather than just being a footnote, because what's happening with the supernatural element of Season 5 is genuinely interesting on a few different levels. Eric Kripke created Supernatural, 15 seasons, which is quite a run for any show, and one that developed an enormous and devoted fan base over those years. Jensen Ackles, who plays Soldier Boy in The Boys, was the lead of Supernatural, playing Dean Winchester for all 15 seasons. So when Ackles was cast in The Boys as a kind of deconstructed Captain America, there was already a metatextual resonance there, Kripke putting his supernatural lead into his new satirical superhero show. What Season 5 adds to that is Jared Padalecki and Misha Collins, the other two central actors from Supernatural's long run. Padalecki plays a character called Mr. Marathon, introduced as the original speedster from the Seven. He predates A-Train, was the speedster before A-Train took the role, and is apparently recruited into the story as part of the conflict around the speed-based elements of Homelander's operation. Collins's role is less specified in what's been made public, but Kripke confirmed explicitly that all three are in the same frame together in Season 5. Kripke's comment about that in an interview was quietly lovely. I will confirm that Jared, Jensen, and Misha are all in the same frame together, and in the same storyline, and interacting with each other. Which is precisely the thing the Supernatural fanbase has been hoping for since Jensen Ackles joined The Boys, and it's being delivered in the final season. It's the show saying thank you to the people who made the previous chapter of its creator's career possible. The interesting thing about the way The Boys handles its fan service, because this is fan service, let's be honest about that, is that it doesn't feel like an obligation or a distraction. The show has always done its pop culture references with a light touch, using them to add texture rather than as the main event. The Supernatural reunion is happening within a story that doesn't require you to know anything about Supernatural to follow. Mr. Marathon being the original speedster is a meaningful addition to the show's mythology regardless of who's playing him. The meta pleasure of seeing Padalecki and Ackles share a scene again is a bonus for people who care, not a demand that everyone care. There's also something about the timing that's worth appreciating. Kripke is ending his current show, the one he's been making for 7 years, and he's bringing people from his previous show, also now ended, to be part of that ending. There's a sense of creative completion in that, a gathering of people who've been part of this work across its different chapters. Seth Rogen is in season 5 as well. Rogen was an executive producer of The Boys from the start through his Point Grey production company, and apparently finally shows up on screen in the final season. These choices have the feeling of someone saying goodbye to a body of work and wanting the right people in the room. The Mr. Marathon character also raises an interesting question about the show's mythology. A-Train died in episode 1. There's now a narrative vacuum where the show's speedster used to be. Mr. Marathon fills that vacuum in some sense, but his presence also recontextualizes A-Train's whole history. A-Train wasn't even the original, wasn't the definitive version of this power, was just the most recent corporate iteration of something that predated him significantly, which fits with the show's argument about Vought. Nothing about it is original. Everything is a product, a commodity, a manufactured symbol. The fact that Mr. Marathon is described as being recruited to fight A-Train, who is already dead by the time this becomes relevant, suggests some timing complexity in how his storyline integrates with the main plot. Whether that leads anywhere interesting, or whether it's primarily just a vehicle for the supernatural reunion, is something the final 3 episodes will clarify. Either way, it's a good thing. Kripke has earned this. The people who spent 15 years watching Supernatural have earned this, and the fact that it's happening in the context of a genuinely good final season, rather than a desperate one, makes it feel like a celebration rather than a consolation. The freedom camps are the clearest signal of what season 5 is interested in arguing. The show has always been political. From the very beginning, it was interested in corporate power, in the relationship between heroism as a brand and heroism as a practice, in what happens when the structures that are supposed to hold power accountable are captured by the powerful. Those have been consistent themes, but season 5 is something slightly different. It's less satirical and more, in a way, earnest about its horror. The freedom camps aren't being played for dark comedy. They're being presented as what they are. The naming is deliberate. Freedom camps as a descriptor for internment facilities is exactly the kind of bureaucratic doublespeak that authoritarian regimes have historically deployed. The naming convention that inverts meaning, that makes the violence sound like a service. North Korea calls its forced labor facilities re-education centers. Guantanamo Bay has been described in terms that minimize what happens there. The show is placing Homelander's camps in that tradition explicitly and trusting its audience to recognize the lineage. The Starlighter label is equally deliberate. One of the things that fascist systems do reliably is create enemy categories, ways of designating certain people as inherently suspect or treasonous. Expressing support for Starlight, the show's shorthand for expressing dissent against Homelander, gets you classified. The classification precedes the punishment. Once you're a Starlighter, you're already guilty of something, and the specific thing you're guilty of can be defined and expanded as needed. What the show is doing here is a portrait of the mechanics of political persecution, and it's doing it in a context that enough of its audience can hold at a slight remove through the superhero framing, but not at quite enough of a remove to pretend it's purely fictional. That slight remove has always been the show's most useful tool. It's what allows it to say things that a straightforwardly realistic political drama couldn't say without seeming like propaganda. Vought News is the propaganda machine that makes the camps possible. Without the media apparatus constantly reframing Homelander's violence as necessary order and the resistance as dangerous terrorism, the public support that allows the camps to exist without rebellion would collapse. The show is very clear about this. Firecrackers, truth bomb TV, the Homelander Bible, the constant reframing of every atrocity as justified, these aren't background texture. They're the infrastructure of the oppression. Ashley's role as press secretary is the show's sharpest observation about how this works at an individual level. She's not a true believer. She doesn't love Homelander or his vision. She's a person who has concluded that her survival requires being useful to the regime, and that being useful to the regime requires saying things she doesn't believe in, public and helping maintain systems she finds horrifying in private. And the show presents this not as a unique moral failure, but as a completely legible human response to impossible circumstances. The teenage kicks who operate as Homelander's enforcement arm inside the camps are the show's portrait of how authoritarianism recruits the young. These are supes who grew up entirely within the Vought system. They've never known anything other than a world where corporate power and heroism are interchangeable, where the institution defines morality rather than the other way around. They're not interrogating their values because they don't have a reference point that would suggest their values need interrogating. They're not monsters, they're products, which is, in a way, more worrying than if they were monsters. Ryan being sought after by this group to lead them, there are suggestions in the plot details that Ryan becomes involved with teenage kicks is the show's most pointed way of asking whether the next generation can break the cycle that the current one couldn't. These are the kids who will inherit whatever is left after the war between Homelander and the Resistance. Whether they inherit a system or a reckoning is the question. One of the things that Season 5 does well, and that I think distinguishes it from more straightforward superhero television, is its insistence that the world being depicted has ordinary people in it. Not just supes and the boys and the Vought executives, but actual civilians living in a country that has been transformed into something frightening, trying to decide what to do about it. The show doesn't spend a lot of time with these characters because it doesn't have the space to, but their presence is felt. The freedom camps are full of them. The Starlighter protests show them. They matter. The show's argument, and this is consistent across all 5 seasons, is that the kind of regime Season 5 depicts doesn't emerge from nowhere. It's built from smaller compromises, earlier failures, things that seemed minor at the time. The Vought structure that allowed Homelander to become what he is was decades in the making. The media ecosystem that now supports him was built for commercial reasons, long before it was used for political ones. None of it was inevitable, but none of it was impossible either. That's the uncomfortable thing the show keeps asking you to sit with. Right, here's the section I've been both looking forward to and slightly dreading. Let's go through this properly, because the show has been very clear that the final season is going to be devastating in terms of who survives. Kripke compared it to Return of the King, which set a fairly specific expectation. So, who have we already lost? A-Train in Episode 1, which we've talked about in the Starlight section, and which I maintain is one of the show's most beautifully executed character exits. He died saving people, he died having reconnected with his family, and he died with the visual callback to the defining act of his first episode. There's a completeness to it. Maverick in Episode 3, a character with some connection to Translucent from Season 1, who came after Huey as revenge and ended up being caught in crossfire. Not a major loss in terms of emotional weight, but a signal that the show's clearing the board. Cindy in Episode 3 as well, snapped by Annie after appearing to have killed Huey. Huey hadn't died, Maverick had. Cindy had been a loose thread from Season 2, this terrifyingly powerful captive from the Sage Grove Center, who escaped and had been unaccounted for. She reappears and dies within the same episode, which feels slightly unceremonious for a character who had that much latent menace. But perhaps that's the point. Not every loose thread pays off spectacularly. Some of them just get tied up. Love Sausage, and I'm going to maintain full solemnity here, was choked to death by mother's milk using his own prehensile member. This is the kind of thing only the boys does, and it does it without any apparent self-consciousness, which is precisely why it works. Firecracker, at the end of episode 5, impaled on an eagle statue by Homelander for the crime of showing doubt, for showing a moment of human uncertainty about whether she was doing the right thing. Homelander kills people for a lot of reasons, but killing Firecracker for doubt rather than for disloyalty is particularly revealing. The doubt alone was enough. The performance of certainty was so central to his religious project that a single visible crack was intolerable. Now for the ones that are still coming, and which I suspect are going to be considerably harder. The information that's circulating about the last 3 episodes is consistent enough from multiple sources that it feels reasonably reliable, though obviously nothing is confirmed until it airs. And the picture it paints is dark. A-Train is gone. Multiple reports suggest that Frenchie, Kimiko, and Mother's Milk don't make it. If that's accurate, losing all 3 of them would mean the boys end the series with Butcher, Huey, and Annie as the only survivors from the main group, and the question of whether Butcher himself survives complicates even that. Losing specifically would be the loss of the show's most consistent moral voice. He's been the person who keeps asking whether what they're doing is right, who keeps refusing to go along with the worst impulses in the room. Without him, the final episodes would be more brutal, more unmediated, less interrupted, which might be exactly why the show kills him when it does. Frenchie and Kimiko together, if it happens, is the kind of loss that would land differently from any individual death, because they represent something to each other and to the group that isn't about power sets or tactical value. They represent the possibility of being something other than what the war made you. If both of them die, the show is saying quite clearly that survival and becoming human again aren't compatible, that the cost of this war is precisely the things that make life worth living. On Homelander himself, the information suggests Butcher kills him in the context of Soldier Boy's explosion, stripping his powers temporarily. Not a heroic duel, not a triumphant defeat, something more messy and provisional than that. Which is, honestly, the right ending for Homelander. He shouldn't die magnificently. He should die because Butcher found a window and used it. Sister Sage apparently doesn't survive the Soldier Boy explosion sequence. The Deep reports suggest he dies, probably pathetically, which is in keeping with his entire characterization. Queen Maeve is one of the more surprising elements in the leaked information. She apparently returns, despite her Season 4 happy ending, and dies in Season 5, which is the show refusing to let anyone have their exit respected. She came back, she was still part of this world, and the world claimed her. That's cruel in a very precise way. And then Butcher, the turn into full villain after Homelander's death, the Kessler persona taking over, Huey being the one who stops him. If all of that happens, then the question of whether Butcher dies or simply ends is very deliberately a question about what ending he deserves. The show, I think, will kill him. Not as a punishment exactly, but because the version of Butcher that exists by that point in the story isn't someone who can be allowed to continue. The mercy would be letting him stop. What I find most interesting about the pattern of deaths the show seems to be building toward is what it says about who gets to have a future. Huey and Annie surviving together, if that's what happens, is a very specific argument. The 2 characters who maintained their humanity, who kept asking whether what they were doing was justified, who kept choosing each other and the people around them over pure mission. The show saying that those 2 specifically get to go forward, that something about caring for people more than winning is what survives. Or maybe I'm being optimistic. Maybe everyone dies. Maybe Kripke's final statement is that the system wins. I don't think so, but I wouldn't put it entirely past him. This is the question the show has been avoiding for 5 seasons, and which it can no longer avoid. If Homelander dies and the Resistance wins in some form, What does the world they've been fighting for actually look like? Vought International is an enormous institution. It's not just a superhero company, it's a media empire, a defense contractor, a pharmaceutical company, a weapons manufacturer, a fast food chain, a theme park, a political influence operation. It has tentacles in virtually every sector of American life. The supes are the most visible part of it, but they're not the whole of it. Removing Homelander, or removing supes entirely, doesn't dismantle the corporate structure that generated him. The show has made this argument repeatedly throughout its run. Stan Edgar, Giancarlo Esposito's magnificently calm and absolutely ruthless CEO, made it most explicitly in his conversations with Homelander, where he kept telling the most powerful being on Earth that he was a product, that Vought owned him, that without the corporate apparatus behind him, he was nothing. Homelander eventually killed for those conversations, which says a lot about their accuracy. Edgar is alive at the midpoint of Season 5, held captive by Homelander after the Deep delivered him. What he knows, what he might be willing to reveal, and what use he might be to the Resistance are all open questions. He's one of those characters where the show has invested enough in his intelligence and self-interest that you'd expect him to find a way to survive somehow. Whether survival for Edgar means anything beyond personal continuity is less clear. The spin-offs are relevant here in a way that's almost too neat. Vought Rising, the planned prequel series set in the 1950s with Jensen Ackles reprising Soldier Boy in his original era, is a project that Kripke has been discussing as the next chapter of the franchise. Its existence implies that Vought as an institution, as a historical entity, has enough story left to tell that it's worth returning to. The 1950s setting would show Frederick Vought himself, the founding mythology of the company, the original sins that cascade into everything Season 5 is about. The fact that this project is in development tells you something about how the show expects to leave things. Vought is probably not destroyed, in any complete sense. The machine is probably still running at the end of Season 5, in modified form, under different management, with different public presentation. Because that's how these institutions work. They adapt, they survive, they put new faces on old structures. The world without supes, if the virus is used, would be a different kind of challenge. You've removed the most visible symbols of Vaught's power, but you haven't removed Vought. You've removed the people who are weaponized, but you haven't removed the weapons manufacturing capacity. You've removed the phenomenon, but not the conditions that made the phenomenon profitable. The show would need to be careful about how it handles this. There's a version of the ending where the characters feel like they've won, because the most immediate, visible threat is gone. And the camera pulls back before you see the institutional machinery recalibrating. That would be an honest ending, a slightly despairing one, but honest. It would be saying, this is the best you can do. Temporary victories, incomplete dismantling, and the knowledge that the system will eventually produce something like this again, unless the structural conditions change. Whether Season 5 has the ambition or the running time to gesture at what those structural conditions are, whether it can say something about the corporate ownership of heroism, the media management of public reality, the institutional normalization of unaccountable power, is a question I'll be watching for in the final 3 episodes. Annie is the character best positioned to carry whatever optimistic version of the future the show is prepared to offer. She has the credibility, the public platform, the genuine moral clarity, and crucially, the survival instincts to be a voice for whatever comes after. If the show gives her that role, if it lets Annie January be the thing that persists, then it's making an argument that decency can outlast catastrophe, that the long game for people who refuse to compromise themselves is that they're still standing when the compromises are gone. I think that's probably what the show's going for. It doesn't seem like a show that ends in pure despair, but it also doesn't seem like a show that ends with everything resolved and everyone happy. It seems like a show that ends with some people alive, some things changed, and a lot of work left to do, which is, in its way, the most honest version of how these things end. Right, Now we're properly in the territory of speculation that's probably wrong, but is fun to think about. And I want to be clear that this section is exactly that. Things I've seen circulating that might be nothing, might be something, and are at least interesting to consider. The first one I want to discuss is the question of whether Butcher and Kessler are actually the same consciousness anymore, or whether the Kessler entity has grown into something more independent than we initially understood. The show presents Kessler as a projection of Butcher's psyche, the darkest, most ruthless part of himself, given a face, but Season 5 has moments where that distinction becomes less clear. Butcher interacts with Kessler in ways that suggest the projection has developed a degree of autonomy, at least from Butcher's perspective. Whether that's psychological deterioration or something more literal, whether the show intends us to read Kessler as a supernatural element rather than a psychological one, is ambiguous in an interesting way. There's a theory that Butcher's compound V powers and the tumor together have created something that isn't quite either of them anymore, that the entity that hunts remaining supes in episodes 7 and 8 is less Billy Butcher having gone rogue, and more whatever emerged from the merger of Butcher and Kessler and tentacles and dying. Which would make Huey's confrontation with him in the finale not just about stopping a friend who went wrong, but about confronting something genuinely monstrous that was once a person. That distinction matters for how the final Huey moment reads. The Barry Black Noir thread is one I find genuinely underexplored. The second Black Noir, the actor who took over the role after Homelander killed the original, has been mainly comic relief in Season 5, a figure of mild pathos playing an enhanced character while clearly being out of his depth. But there's a scene in Episode 5 where the Deep makes a pointed remark about Noir, engaging in illegal activities and autrui, and Homelander's art ban under the National Endowment for the Arts supposedly means the theatrical production Barry Noir was involved with constitutes treason. There's something building there around what Noir does with that grievance. The show has introduced it deliberately enough that it presumably pays off. Whether Barry has any powers of his own is a question that hasn't been resolved. He took the Black Noir suit, which presumably has some enhancement built into it. But whether he has any actual compound V in his system, or whether he's just a man in a mask trying to keep up with literal superhumans, is something the show has been coy about. The Homelander as genuinely divine theory is one that circulates on fan forums with more seriousness than it probably warrants, but it's worth mentioning. The argument is that Homelander's religious visions, the Madeline Stillwell hallucinations, the divine calling he feels are being presented by the show ambiguously, and that there's a reading where his messianic self-conception isn't entirely delusion. The show is very careful throughout its run to keep the supernatural firmly off the table. This is a world of corporate science and compound V, not miracles. But Homelander's connection to his visions is unusual enough that some fans have speculated the show's leaving room for something stranger. I don't buy it, but it's out there. The Stan Edgar wildcard theory is one I find more plausible. He's alive, he's captured, and he knows more about Vaught's history and operations than anyone currently living. In Season 1, when Butcher was trying to bring down Vought, the thing he most needed was evidence, proof of what Compound V was and what Vought had done with it. Edgar has that evidence in his head in abundance. The theory is that Edgar, being above all else a pragmatist, decides at some point that cooperating with the resistance serves his interests better than Homelander's continued rise. Not because he's good, but because Homelander's particular brand of chaos is bad for business, in a long-term sense that Edgar, being an institutional thinker, finds genuinely troubling. The Oh Father reveal is one I'm most genuinely curious about. Daveed Diggs was cast in a main role for Season 5 back in September 2024, and his character's name wasn't made public until March 2026, very close to the premiere. That kind of information management is usually a sign that the character's role is a spoiler in some way, that knowing who they are changes how you read other elements of the story. Oh Father as a name has obvious religious connotations, which fits with Season 5's theological preoccupations. Whether he's a genuine divine figure, an opponent of Homelander's Messiah project, or something more grounded isn't clear from what's been shown publicly. There's a small fan theory about the freedom camps having a specific structural weakness that the resistance hasn't exploited yet, something about the soup guards at the camps being drawn from the Teenage Kicks cohort, which means they're young, they're ideologically captured rather than true believers, and they might be more susceptible to doubt than older Vought assets. The parallel to organised religion is intentional, and the show's track record of having doubters within the system, Firecracker's relationship with Greg Dupree, Ashley's quiet resistance, suggests it's interested in internal fractures as mechanisms of change rather than just frontal assault. And then there's the theory I find most charming, which is that the show's final scene is something very quiet. Not a battle, not a policy speech, not a newscast showing the world beginning to heal. Just Huey and Annie, somewhere ordinary, doing something ordinary. Which would be the most pointed possible statement from a show that has spent 5 seasons showing what happens when ordinary life is destroyed by extraordinary power. The radical act of having a normal day. Sitting together? Being okay? I'd like that. I probably won't get it, but I'd like it. And I think that's probably where I'll leave it tonight. We've covered a lot of ground. Homelander's God complex, Butcher's descent, the whole V1 situation, Ryan, Soldier Boy, the comics, the deaths, the theories about what the ending might look like. There are 3 episodes left. The finale airs the 20th of May. And I have no idea exactly how it's going to go, which is one of the more pleasant things about a final season that's actually been doing its job properly. What I keep coming back to, thinking about the boys as a whole thing, is how much it's been about the ordinary people caught in these systems rather than just the extraordinary ones. Huey, Mother's Milk, Frenchie, Annie before she became a symbol. The show's argument has always been, underneath all the viscera and the satire, that the people who matter aren't the ones with superpowers. They're the ones who keep asking whether what's happening is right, who keep insisting that the answer to "what do I have to do to survive" can't always be whatever it takes. That argument is more relevant now than it was when the show started, which is either the most depressing possible observation or the most optimistic one, depending on how you look at it. I'm going to have more boys content coming, individual character deep dives, a proper look at the comics to show differences in full, and probably a retrospective once the finale has aired and we can look at the whole shape of it. If that sounds like something you'd be interested in, you know where to find me. For now though, I hope you've had a gentle evening with all of this. The Boys is a lot, it's always been a lot, but there's something oddly soothing about sitting with it at this hour, turning all the theories over slowly without any urgency attached. The show will do what it's going to do in the final 3 weeks. All we can do is watch. Take care of yourselves, sleep well, and we'll talk again soon. End of script. Something I didn't fully explore in the initial pass is the specific texture of everyday life in Season 5's America, and I think it's worth spending a bit more time on because the show does it well without making it the explicit subject of every scene. The horror is ambient. It's in the background. People are categorized, monitored, afraid. Not in a cartoonish way, in the way that the show has always been better at than most, which is depicting fear that looks like it could actually happen. The home teamer Starlighter binary is interesting precisely because of how it functions as a social mechanism rather than just a political one. It's the kind of division that gets into workplaces, into families, into the small interactions of daily life. Do you display the Homelander imagery? Do you say the right things when someone's listening? It's not about whether you believe in what Homelander represents. It's about visible alignment. And the show is astute enough to know that most people in systems like this operate in that middle ground. Not true believers, not active resistors, just trying to get through the day without being noticed. There's a scene in episode 1 where Homelander speaks at what functions as a kind of state ceremony, and the crowd's reaction is performed enthusiasm with a layer of fear underneath it that the camera catches in the faces of the people around the edges. The people at the centre of the frame are home teamers, visibly committed. The people at the edges are doing the calculus in real time. How much do I have to perform to be safe? That's a very specific kind of political observation, and the show makes it with a single camera choice. The freedom camps also function within the show's internal logic as a way of rendering visible the people who are always there. There have always been people who are resistant to the Vought project, who asked uncomfortable questions, who didn't buy the brand. Under normal conditions, those people were marginalized through more diffuse mechanisms, media coverage that dismissed them, social pressure, the sheer weight of the dominant narrative. The freedom camps are what happens when the mask comes off and the marginalization becomes literal. They're not a new development, they're the same impulse made explicit. The character of Zoe, Newman's daughter, who wants Butcher dead, represents something that Season 5 has been more interested in than earlier seasons. The perspective of someone who has been collateral damage to the good guys, not the bad ones. Newman was a complicated figure. She had blood on her hands, she made terrible choices, but she was also Zoe's mother. And Zoe's grief doesn't care about the moral calculus. Her mother was killed by the person the show has been positioning as its protagonist, or at least its primary anti-hero. And her desire for vengeance is completely comprehensible, even as it creates real complications for the narrative. The show has always been better than most at this, at giving the people who are supposed to be obstacles their own coherent interiority. Zoe isn't just a plot complication. She's a person whose mother is dead and who has legitimate reasons for every feeling she has about that. And Dr. Shah destroying the virus because of his grief about Newman, the man whose daughter loved Zoe, is the show doing what it does best, showing how personal loss and political mission interact in ways that are messy and human and genuinely tragic. One more thing worth adding here is the time jump element and what it does for the show's pacing. Season 5 picking up a year after Season 4 means we're dropped into a world that has already adjusted to its new reality. The shock of Homelander's ascendancy has worn off. People have built new routines around it. The resistance has been going for a year without obviously succeeding. That's a different emotional register than watching something terrible begin. It's watching something terrible become normal, which is, if anything, more disturbing. The Democratic Church of America as an institution is the corporate version of this. It's Vaught's machinery applied to theological product, which is, in a completely literal sense, what it is. Vought has been in the business of manufacturing symbols for commercial purposes since the beginning. Homelander as Jesus is just a logical extension of Homelander as Superman. Same infrastructure, different story being sold. There's a character note in the firecracker Greg Dupree scene that I think is one of the season's best moments, and I want to revisit it for a moment. Greg tells Firecracker that the church she grew up in, his church, the Holy Baptist of Daytona, is now being shaken down by praying mantis for franchise fees. This is her church, the place where she developed whatever values she has, and she can't protect it because protecting it would mean going against Homelander, and going against Homelander would mean losing her position. She's trapped. The system she helped build has closed around her own history, and then she dies for showing doubt anyway, which suggests that whatever her original motivations were for working with Homelander, survival, ideology, something else, those origins were already gone by the time the season reaches its midpoint. She had become entirely a function of the apparatus. The Greg conversation was one last moment of being a person, and it's the one that got her killed. The Madeline Stillwell hallucinations have another dimension worth noting. Stillwell, in life, was the person who managed Homelander through a combination of exploitation and performed maternal love. She fed into his neediness rather than addressing it, because a psychologically dependent Homelander was more useful to Vought than a psychologically healthy one, though the question of what a psychologically healthy Homelander would even look like is one I'm not sure the show wants to answer. In his hallucinations, she's become something purer than she ever was in life. She's the idealized version of the thing he could never have, someone who loves him unconditionally and wants him to be great. His subconscious is constructing the parent he never had and giving it her face, which is the show's most direct engagement with the question of how someone becomes Homelander. Not evil, not malice, just the accumulated weight of never having been loved correctly. I don't think that justifies anything he does, but understanding it is different from excusing it, and the show has always been better at understanding than excusing. One of the things the show does quietly well with the V1 storyline is use it to make the past material. The events of the 1950s Frederick Vought's original program, Fort Harmony, the military supers who were created there, aren't just backstory. They're the literal chemistry that determines who survives the final season. The past isn't past. It's in Soldier Boy's blood. It's the thing everyone's racing to control. Fort Harmony as a location deserves more attention than I gave it earlier. The show presents it as a place of both grand ambition and horrifying practice, the American dream of superpower applied to military technology, with all the ethical compromises that required. Frederick Vought believed he was creating the future. He was creating it on the bodies of the people he experimented on, in conditions that would have been recognizable to anyone familiar with the more troubling aspects of mid-century American medical experimentation. The show draws that parallel without being heavy-handed about it. It's just there, in the architecture, in the records Mother's Milk finds. The V1 formula being in Soldier Boy's body, rather than in a lab or a document, is a structurally elegant choice. It means the MacGuffin is a person, not an object, not a file, not a piece of hardware that can be simply retrieved or destroyed. To get V1, you have to deal with Soldier Boy. You have to negotiate with, manipulate, or harm a person who has his own agenda and his own fragile relationship with the people who want what's inside him. That's dramatically richer than a briefcase. The question of consent that the V1 storyline opens up is one the show handles interestingly. Soldier Boy didn't choose to have V1 in his system. It was injected into him by Vought in the 1950s as part of a program he was recruited into under what we can reasonably assume were conditions of significant manipulation, if not outright coercion. His body contains this substance. People want it. He's being treated as a resource, which is, again, exactly the dynamic the show has been criticizing in the soup industrial complex from the beginning. The fact that Soldier Boy is himself monstrous doesn't change the structural observation. He's still a person whose body is being treated as a commodity. The Russian angle adds another dimension. The Soviets got Soldier Boy in the 1970s. Vought sold him, essentially, in a deal that was kept secret from the American public. And whatever they did with him during those decades could have included research into the V1 that was in his blood. If the Russians have been running their own V1-based program, or if they have research that would be useful to either side in the Season 5 conflict, that explains the Russian presence in the show's current storyline without requiring it to be purely about geopolitics. There's also a small but interesting detail in the way the show frames the question of why the virus didn't kill Soldier Boy. It worked on other Teenage Kicks members, who are presumably younger and have standard formula compound V in their systems. The fact that it got to Soldier Boy and clearly affected him before his V1-based physiology pushed back suggests that the difference between V1 and standard compound V isn't binary. It's gradient, which opens up the interesting theoretical question of whether a sufficiently modified virus could bridge the gap, could kill someone with V1 in their system, which is presumably what the enhanced virus that gets used on Soldier Boy in the finale represents. The ethical question of whether it's acceptable to use Soldier Boy as the delivery mechanism for that virus, injecting him with it, knowingly causing an explosion that will kill him without his meaningful consent, is one the show will probably not slow down enough to address directly. Butcher isn't in a space where that question feels salient to him, but it matters. And it connects to the broader question of what the show is saying about the ends and means calculation. Using a person who was himself used by Vought, using him in exactly the way Vought used people to destroy the thing Vought built. The show's too smart to miss that irony, even if it doesn't explicitly call it out. Something I want to add to the Butcher discussion is the specific quality of Karl Urban's performance in Season 5, because it's carrying enormous weight, and it deserves acknowledgement. Urban has always been good in this role, the gruffness, the barely suppressed violence, the occasional moments of unexpected tenderness that make you remember what Butcher could have been. But in Season 5, there's something additional. There's a tiredness, not the laziness of an actor going through the motions, but the exhaustion of a character who has been fighting a war for so long that he's forgotten what he was fighting it for. The tentacle moments are particularly striking. When Butcher uses his tumor-given powers, Urban plays it with a kind of grim satisfaction that's more disturbing than if it were played with evident pleasure. He's not enjoying the violence, he's just doing it, the way someone might do something unpleasant but necessary. The problem is that the necessity is increasingly self-defined. He's decided the violence is necessary, which means there's no external check on what falls into the category. The Becca question is worth returning to. Becca was Butcher's wife, and her death at the end of Season 2, killed by Ryan's laser vision in the chaos. Not by any intent, but by the same kind of accident that defines how this world hurts people, is the wound that never healed. Everything Butcher has done since then has been in part a way of not sitting with that loss. The mission has been the anesthetic. And now, in Season 5, the mission is so consuming that it's erasing the thing it was supposed to be in service of. He's breaking his promise to Becca about Ryan. He's becoming the kind of person Becca would have been horrified by. He's losing her again, in a different way, through his own choices. There's a reading of Butcher's entire arc as a grief narrative that the show has been half committed to from the beginning. Season 1 established him as a man defined by loss. Becca, the failure of his marriage, the years of pursuing Homelander, but positioned it primarily as righteous anger. Seasons 2 and 3 complicated that by showing that his anger had always had a dark edge, that the version of Butcher who appeared in Season 1 was already a refined version rather than an original. Season 4 took the refinement apart entirely, and Season 5 is the result. What grief does when it goes unprocessed and unfaced is harden. It calcifies. It becomes the shape of the person. Butcher has never once, in 5 seasons, properly sat with what he's lost. He's moved, he's fought, he's had brief moments of connection with Huey, with Ryan, with the boys collectively. But those connections have always been in service of the mission, rather than the mission being in service of them. He put the cart before the horse at some point, and the horse died, and he's been pulling the cart himself ever since. The relationship with Huey is the thread I find most interesting in the final stretch, because Huey is, in some ways, the thing Butcher could have been. He's the young man who lost someone to supe violence, who was drawn into this world through grief, who could have gone the same direction. And he didn't. He kept asking the hard questions. He kept refusing to fully become the mission. He's infuriating to Butcher, precisely because he represents a version of this story where the person survives themselves. If Huey stops Butcher at the end, it's not just a narrative event. It's the show's most explicit statement about what it's been arguing for 5 seasons, that the choice to remain human, to keep asking whether what you're doing is right, is the only thing that separates the people we're supposed to root for from the people we're supposed to fear. I want to return to Soldier Boy because I don't think I adequately captured the specific quality of tragedy in his story, and it's a subtle one. He's not a sympathetic character. Let's be clear about that. His history includes domestic violence, racism, assault, a pattern of behaviour that's been enabled by decades of institutional protection. He was given a hero's mythology and used it as cover for being awful in the specific way that extremely powerful men who face no consequences tend to be awful. He's not the victim here in any straightforward sense. But the show has always been interested in the manufactured nature of heroism, in the way that Vought took people and made symbols out of them, and in the gap between the symbol and the person. And Soldier Boy is one of the clearest expressions of that. He was shaped by the 1950s version of Vought, by Vought himself, by the Cold War context, by a culture that was building the mythology of the American superhero for explicitly political purposes. The person he became was, in large part, a product of that shaping, which doesn't excuse anything, but it does place him in a continuum with Homelander that the show draws explicitly. Both of them were manufactured. Both of them were given identities designed to serve an institution rather than to express a self. Both of them are, in different ways, the result of Vaught's decisions about what heroes should be. Homelander came after Soldier Boy, was built on the model that Soldier Boy established, is in some sense Soldier Boy 2.0, and now they're both trapped in this dynamic with each other, neither capable of having the relationship they actually need because neither knows what having that kind of relationship even looks like. The father-son relationship is tragic precisely because it could have been something. Not good exactly, both of them are too damaged for good, but something. Some form of recognition. Instead, Homelander sent his father to die within weeks of them meeting, and Soldier Boy survived and is presumably now working through what that means. In a more psychological drama, that would be the core of the final season. In The Boys, it's one of many threads, and the show handles it as such. Jensen Ackles talked in interviews about wanting to give Soldier Boy something like dimension in Season 5, and based on what's been seen so far, he's getting some of that. The scenes with Homelander have a different quality from the Season 3 dynamic. There's more history between them now, more established injury. Whether any of that nuance survives the final battle sequence, when the show's demands become primarily kinetic, is the question. And here's a fun detail about all of this, if you can call it fun. The real Operation Paperclip, which the show's Vought is based on, actually happened. The US government recruited over 1,600 German scientists and engineers after World War II, some of them with genuinely troubling wartime histories, in the name of Cold War advantage. If you haven't gone down that history rabbit hole, I'd recommend it, and also immediately regret recommending it. The show's Vaught's Nazi collaborator turned American institution is not actually that far from the historical precedent, which is one of those facts that sits uncomfortably in the back of your mind while the show's being outrageous. The outrage is partially rooted in things that actually happened. One of the things that's been underrated in the discussion of Ryan's arc is the show's handling of what you might call the inheritance question, whether the circumstances of your birth determine who you can become. The show's treatment of this has been subtle across several seasons. Ryan was conceived through rape, which is information he eventually learns, and which the show doesn't ask him to process as quickly or neatly as that kind of revelation would be processed in a more conventional drama. He grew up with Becca trying to give him a normal life. He met Butcher, and that complicated everything. He met Homelander, and that complicated it further. And throughout all of that, the show has maintained that Ryan is a person in formation, not yet determined, still capable of going in various directions. The scene in episode 3 where he attacks Homelander is the show testing that. Here is Ryan, given what should be an overwhelming reason for violence. His mother was assaulted, Homelander is responsible. He has the power to at least attempt something, and the show is watching to see what he does with those conditions. He acts, he fails, he nearly dies. And the question of whether that failure is also a kind of moral information, whether Ryan trying to fight Homelander and being beaten was in some ways better than succeeding would have been, is one the show hasn't answered yet. There's a specific detail about Ryan's powers that I find interesting and that the show has been playing with quietly. He has the same general power set as Homelander, but Homelander's psychological relationship to his powers is one of total ownership. They're an extension of his will, an expression of his ego. Ryan's relationship to his powers is different. He's afraid of them sometimes. He's surprised by them. He doesn't fully control them, which is how Grace Mallory died at the end of season 4. Not because Ryan wanted her dead, but because the powers responded to his emotional state before his deliberate intent could shape them. That lack of control is the opposite of Homelander's relationship to power, and it's significant because Homelander's power comes from certainty, from never doubting himself long enough for the doubt to interfere with the action. Ryan's uncertainty might actually be the thing that makes him capable of something Homelander never could be: genuine restraint. The ability to choose not to use the power or to use it differently because he knows it's not always right. Whether the show makes that explicit in the final episodes is the question. Whether it trusts Ryan's uncertainty as a virtue rather than just a limitation. The Zoe subplot and Ryan's interaction with Newman's daughter adds another dimension. Zoe wants Butcher dead. Ryan hesitates. He's been used by Butcher, and he knows it. And there's some residual loyalty there that even the knowledge of Butcher's worst intentions hasn't fully erased, which is a specifically adolescent kind of loyalty, the kind that persists past the point where it makes rational sense because relationships aren't rational. Ryan's connection to the people around him is more emotionally tethered than Homelander's, which was always instrumental. That emotional tethering is either his greatest vulnerability. Homelander could weaponize it, and the show has shown him attempting to, or his greatest strength, depending on how the show wants to frame it in the finale. The question of what the show actually believes about collective action and individual culpability is one that the virus storyline forces into the open in a way the previous seasons didn't quite manage. The show has always been suspicious of everything, really. Corporations, governments, institutions. It doesn't map cleanly onto left or right politics because that's not what it's doing. It's more a consistent argument that anyone with that much power and that little accountability is going to abuse it, which is a concern that tends to hold regardless of which side of the aisle is doing the abusing. It's suspicious of heroism as an ideology for exactly the same reason. The idea that certain people are exempt from moral accountability because of what they represent is the same logic, regardless of who's claiming the exemption. The virus plan is where that suspicion of concentrated power meets its own contradiction. Because if you're genuinely against the idea that any person or institution should have the right to make unilateral decisions about who lives and dies, then Butcher's plan is exactly that. He's decided unilaterally that a class of people, defined by a biological characteristic they didn't choose, should not exist. His reasoning might be different from Homelander's reasoning for his violence, but the structure of the decision is the same. Mother's Milk's resistance to this is the show's most coherent counter-argument, and it's worth sitting with. His position isn't that supes are innocent, it's that the mechanism of collective punishment is wrong regardless of how justified the specific targets might be. You can't design a response to injustice that is itself unjust and expect the injustice to resolve. The virus would kill Homelander. It would also kill Ryan, who is 14 and has spent his life being traumatized by the circumstances of his creation. Those two outcomes are not the same. Treating them as acceptable trade-offs is the corruption the show has been tracing in Butcher from the beginning. What I find particularly sophisticated about the show's handling of this is that it doesn't let Mother's Milk's position be simply correct either. His emotional clarity about Kimiko and about Starlight doesn't automatically translate into a viable alternative plan. He knows what's wrong with Butcher's plan. He's less clear on what would work instead. The show is not offering a clean, progressive alternative to Butcher's ruthlessness. It's showing the difficulty of action in a genuinely terrible situation, where all the available options have costs attached to them, and where the most morally defensible position sometimes has the least practical purchase. The philosophical question of whether a world without supes is better or worse is also more complicated than it first appears. In the immediate term, yes, removing the capacity for Vought to create and weaponize people with superhuman powers would remove a specific threat. But the demand for power doesn't disappear because one supply mechanism is eliminated. Vaught's pharmaceutical capacity, military contracting relationships, media infrastructure, all of that remains. The gaps that supes filled in the power structure would be filled by other things, possibly worse things in some respects, because at least supes have individual psychology that occasionally produces something like conscience. The show probably won't resolve this question. It can't within the space it has. But by raising it clearly in the final season, by making the central MacGuffin also the central moral crisis, it's doing what the best final seasons of ambitious shows do, asking its biggest questions at the moment when the audience is most invested and has the most context to engage with them properly. Let me add something to the Starlight section that I think matters for understanding her role in the show's final argument. Annie January didn't start out knowing what Vought was. She grew up idolizing the Seven. She had a mother who weaponized that admiration to manage her, to make her compliant and driven, and ultimately to get her auditioned for the biggest corporate superhero operation in the world. Her entry into the Seven in season 1 is framed as a dream come true, and then immediately, systematically, the show deconstructs that dream. Within a few episodes, she's seen who these people actually are, what this institution actually does, what the deal actually requires, what makes Annie interesting, and what the show has been careful to protect across 5 seasons, is that she doesn't become cynical. She doesn't respond to the disillusionment by abandoning the underlying values that made her want to be a hero in the first place. She becomes more honest. She becomes angrier. She becomes willing to do things she wouldn't have done at the beginning. But she doesn't conclude that the dream was wrong, only that the institution claiming to represent it was corrupted. That distinction is the show's argument about idealism. Idealism isn't naive, it says. Idealism that ignores evidence is naive. But idealism that incorporates evidence, that gets harder and clearer because it's been tested rather than softer because it's been disappointed, that's something else. That's what survives. Annie's light powers, which seem to grow stronger throughout the series, are the show's visual metaphor for this. The idealism doesn't diminish, it becomes more powerful because it's been refined by difficulty. The resistance she's been mounting in the time jump year of season 5 is an expression of this. She doesn't have Butcher's resources. She doesn't have the boys' network in its full form. She's been doing it with what she has, which is her powers, her public recognition, and her willingness to keep showing up. That's not glamorous. It's not the superhero fantasy. It's the actual work of resistance, which is unglamorous and slow and full of small defeats. A-Train's story intersects with Annie's in a way that's worth noting. He was, at the start, a version of everything she was trying not to be, completely captured by the Vought brand, willing to do anything to maintain his position, capable of extraordinary violence and unable to take responsibility for it. Watching him move towards something better across the series, slowly, incompletely, with multiple failures and retreats, has been one of the more humanizing threads in a show that doesn't always find room for rehabilitation, and he died saving her, and her friends, and the people they're fighting for, which is either ironic or poetically appropriate, depending on your reading. I lean toward the latter. The man who was most defined by running from things died standing his ground. That's a kind of beauty, even in this particular show's aesthetic vocabulary. The Gen V characters joining the resistance represents the next generation of the same story Annie started. They went to Godolphin University believing in something. They discovered what was underneath that something, and they made the same choice she made, not to become cynical, but to become clear. The fact that this is the pattern the show keeps returning to, young people, disillusionment, a choice about whether to give up or reorient, suggests it's close to the show's central argument about how good things happen. Not through institutions, through individuals who refuse to be entirely captured by them. I want to add a bit more to several of these, on Frenchie specifically. Frenchie is one of those characters where the show has done something unusual, given a person with a genuinely dark history a path towards something like peace without that path being either too easy or too melodramatic. His past involvement with a gang and the deaths that resulted from choices he made have been present throughout the series as a weight he carries. Not as a secret to be revealed at a dramatic moment, but as something he lives with, that shapes how he sees himself and what he feels he deserves. The relationship with Kimiko has been his primary redemptive arc, in the sense that loving her and being loved by her, which he initially struggled to accept, has given him a reference point that isn't defined by his worst self. He still does terrible things sometimes. The show doesn't scrub that. But he does them in the context of someone who sees all of it and chooses him anyway, which is its own kind of grace. His imprisonment in the freedom camp in the year before Season 5 proper would have been its own kind of ordeal. What that does to him, what residue it leaves, whether that year hardened him toward Butcher's position or moved him toward MM's, is something the show has been suggesting but not fully revealing. Toma Capone's performance carries a weight in Season 5 that wasn't quite there in earlier seasons, and it's the weight of someone who has seen the inside of what they were fighting against. On the deep, a bit more, Kevin's specific arc in Season 5, still doing Homelander's bidding, still desperate for approval, is almost a parody of loyalty as a survival strategy. He delivered Stan Edgar to Homelander in Episode 3 as a gesture of usefulness, which is exactly the kind of thing the Deep does. Finds some piece of service he can render and performs it with enough enthusiasm that maybe this time he'll be genuinely valued rather than tolerated. What the show has done with him across 5 seasons is something quite uncommon. It hasn't rehabilitated him or condemned him as irredeemable. It's kept him in this liminal space where every episode you're slightly uncertain whether he's going to do something cowardly and self-serving or accidentally do something decent. That uncertainty is its own kind of characterization. He's not predictable because he doesn't know what he's going to do next either. He just responds to circumstances with the tools he has, which are considerable in terms of power and very limited in terms of character. Whether the Deep survives Season 5 and what form that survival takes is a genuinely open question as of Episode 5. Reports suggest he dies, which would be a certain kind of symmetry. He's been living on borrowed time and borrowed approval for years. On Ashley's Compound V arc, the mind-reading power is the show's most pointed joke about what happens when you give someone access to everyone's innermost thoughts and the capacity for strategic use of information. Ashley has been reading people strategically her entire career. That's how she got to where she is, by understanding what people want and what they fear and using that knowledge. Compound V just made it literal. What's interesting is how the show frames her use of those powers. She's not suddenly altruistic. She's not transformed into a hero by having superhuman abilities. She's Ashley, just with more information. The small ways she helps the resistance, the subtle assists, the information passed at the right moment, are consistent with someone who has always been more interested in survival than ideology, and who has determined that the regime's long-term survival is less certain than the resistance's. That calculation could be wrong. Ashley making a strategic bet on the right horse and having it pay off would be a kind of satisfying conclusion for a character who has spent 5 seasons making uncomfortable compromises. But it would also be the show letting her off the hook for a lot of things. Whether it's willing to do that is one of the smaller questions I'm curious about in the final episodes. There's something worth adding here about how Kripke approaches the adaptation question, because it gives you a better sense of what to expect from the finale. In interviews across the series run, Kripke has been consistent about one principle. He treats the comics as a source of inspiration rather than a blueprint. The emotional truth of Ennis's story, the corruption of heroism, the cost of being right in a system that doesn't reward it, the specific tragedy of Butcher, that's what he's preserving. The specific plot mechanics, the specific people, those he's willing to change. What this means in practice is that the show has been building toward an ending that feels thematically like the comics, even when it doesn't replicate it literally. The shape of what's coming, Butcher going rogue, the question of whether the cause justifies the man, Huey as the show's moral anchor, has been the shape of the comic's ending since the beginning. The specifics of how that plays out have been constructed by the writers around the characters they've actually developed. The Homelander question is where this matters most. Comics. Homelander dies because Black Noir is a clone designed to kill him. The resolution is almost mechanical, a designed failsafe doing its job. Show Homelander is more complicated. He's genuinely pitiable in ways comics Homelander wasn't. More human in his damage, if not in his behaviour. His death, whenever it comes, needs to feel like the conclusion of a specific character's journey rather than just the elimination of a threat. It needs to be about him, not just about the problem he represents. Whether the Butcher kills him in a window of vulnerability approach achieves, that is something I'm genuinely unsure about. It's efficient, it's plot satisfying, but there's an argument that Homelander deserves a more psychologically weighted ending, a moment where his fundamental delusion is made visible to him, where he has to face that the love he's been demanding was never the love he actually needed. Whether he gets that, or whether he just dies in the chaos of the finale's action, might be the difference between an ending that's memorable for its narrative clarity and one that's memorable for its emotional complexity. The Blood and Bone finale title, as I mentioned, comes from Homelander's promise to Butcher in Season 3. But there's another reading of it that I find interesting. Blood and bone are what we're made of. They're the material of people, stripped of all the symbolic and institutional accretions. The season that's been about a man becoming a god, about corporate mythology and religious branding and the manufactured nature of heroism, ending with the phrase blood and bone, is a way of saying, here's what's underneath all of it. Just people. Destructible, mortal, made of stuff that can be hurt and can bleed. It's a deflation as much as a climax. Which feels right for this show. Something I want to return to in this section is the question of what it would mean, thematically, for each of the candidate killers to be the one who does it. If Ryan kills Homelander, the show's argument is the next generation can break cycles that the current one couldn't. Ryan, despite everything done to him, despite being made partly of the man he kills, finds a way to choose differently. That's an optimistic statement, and it's one the show would have to earn carefully. The optimism can't be cheap. Ryan would have to carry the cost of that act forward in a way that shows the show isn't pretending it was clean. If Butcher kills Homelander, the show's argument is the only thing that can stop this kind of power is someone equally willing to abandon the rules. Which is almost a despairing argument. It says, moral compromise is the price of effectiveness. The good people got here, but they couldn't close the deal. It took the person willing to go further than anyone should go. That's a dark conclusion, and if it's the one the show makes, the subsequent turn where Butcher becomes the threat, is the show immediately undercutting it, saying, yes, but look what that costs. If Soldier Boy is the delivery mechanism and Butcher is the final agent, it splits the difference in an interesting way. The physical mechanism is someone who is also a product of the system, Vaught's creation, used and discarded and used again. And the killing blow is delivered by someone who has gone so far that he's barely recognizable as the person we started with. That's a bleak symmetry. The Vought product defeats the Vought product through the agency of the Vought system's most corrupted human remnant. The depowered version of the death is also interesting. If Homelander is temporarily stripped of his powers by Soldier Boy's explosion, what does that moment look like, psychologically? For the first time in his existence, literally, since he was given compound fee as an infant, he would be physically ordinary. He would be, for however brief a window, a man with no particular advantage. That's a terrifying thing to give someone who has built their entire identity around being exceptional. What does Homelander do when he's not exceptional? What is he? The show might not have time to explore that properly in the action of the finale, but the possibility of it, the glimpse of Homelander as just a person, might be the most interesting moment of the death sequence, even if it only lasts a few seconds. And then there's the question of whether anyone witnesses it who is positioned to tell the story afterward. Because in the boys' political universe, the narrative of what happened matters enormously. If Homelander dies in a way that can't be publicly reported, or can be reported differently by Vaught's media machinery, then the death might not achieve the symbolic disruption that would make it meaningful beyond the immediate tactical gain. The show has been very clear, throughout its run, that the storytelling around events is as important as the events themselves. Who gets to tell the story of Homelander's death will shape what comes after. There's a wider point to make in the context of the supernatural reunion about what it looks like when a showrunner genuinely loves the thing they've made. Eric Kripke has been remarkably consistent across the run of The Boys about what he's trying to do and why. He hasn't pivoted the show's political argument because it became more or less controversial. He hasn't softened the violence or the darkness in response to criticism. He's written a show about corporate power and heroism as a product and the cost of fighting corrupt institutions, and he's followed that argument wherever it's led him, including to places that are genuinely uncomfortable. The decision to end The Boys at season 5 is part of this. A show this successful, with this audience, could have run for another 3 or 4 seasons on commercial momentum alone. Kripke had a story to tell, he told it, and then he decided it was done. That's not how television usually works. That kind of creative confidence is rare and worth appreciating. The emotional investment of the cast is consistent with this. When actors talk about a final season, you get a sense pretty quickly of whether they're going through the motions or whether the show means something to them. The interviews around The Boys season 5 have been full of genuine feeling. Anthony Starr's tribute to the cast, crew and fanbase, Carl Urban's emotional social media posts from set, Kripke's farewell message from the set on the last day of filming. This is the last time I'll ever be on this set. It'll be torn down soon. It's bittersweet, but my primary feeling is gratitude. That's someone who has made something they're proud of and knows it. The Jared Padalecki casting in that context takes on a slightly different quality than pure fan service. It's Kripke saying, here's the person who was part of the work that led to this. Here's the acknowledgement that one chapter of creative life connects to the next. It's the kind of gesture that's genuinely generous rather than calculated, and in a television landscape that often feels relentlessly commercial, it stands out. Mr. Marathon as the original speedster also gives the show an opportunity to do something it hasn't done much. Look at the history of what supes were before the 7, before the contemporary Vought branding operation, before Homelander. Soldier Boy comes from that era, but his story has been primarily about his present. A character who predates even Soldier Boy, or who is at least from the same era of the original program, could add texture to the show's historical argument about how we got here. Whether the final 3 episodes use that texture, or whether Mr. Marathon is primarily there for the emotional resonance of the reunion, is a question the finale will answer. Either way, his presence means something to a significant portion of the audience, and that meaning is being honoured rather than exploited. Let me add some more texture to what the show's actually saying about the political moment it's depicting. The freedom camps, I want to argue, aren't primarily a comment on any specific policy or any specific administration. They're a comment on a structural tendency, the way that liberal democratic institutions, under sufficient stress and with sufficient political will applied in the wrong direction, can slide toward authoritarian forms without any single dramatic rupture. There's no moment in The Boys Season 5 where America becomes a dictatorship. It already was one by the time the season starts. The slide happened in the background of the previous seasons, gradually, through mechanisms that each seemed individually defensible, or at least comprehensible. Executive authority expanded here, judicial independence compromised there, media concentration accelerating the whole time. This is more frightening than a dramatic coup. A coup is visible. You can point to it. What The Boys depicts is more like the gradual drying up of the things that make democratic accountability possible. The erosion of independent information, of institutions that resist capture, of the cultural confidence that dissent is legitimate. By the time you have the freedom camps, those things have already been gone for long enough that the camps seem like a natural development rather than a rupture. The Vought news machine is doing specific work in this analysis. It's not just that Homelander has a propaganda apparatus, it's that the propaganda apparatus precedes him and will probably outlast him. It existed to serve Vought's commercial interests before it served Homelander's political ones. The technology of media manufacturing, the capacity to shape public perception of events, independent of the events themselves, is a corporate product that gets repurposed for political ends. Which is, again, a description of things that actually happen. The show's analysis of Christian nationalism is particularly pointed because it's engaging with a real institutional development rather than a cartoon. The actual Christian nationalist movement in America, the argument that America is a Christian nation and that Christian principles should guide law and policy, including Christian principles, as interpreted by a specific tradition that tends to align conveniently with a specific political agenda, exists. Churches are being asked to make political commitments in exchange for political favour. The line between faith and political organisation is being deliberately blurred. The show is taking all of that and rendering it as Homelander's specific religious project, which makes it visible in a way that the diffuse institutional version of it sometimes isn't. What makes this effective as satire rather than just as political commentary is that it runs these real tendencies through characters we care about. Firecracker isn't just a symbol of right-wing media. She's a person who grew up in a real church, had a real mentor, made real choices that led her to this place. Greg Dupree isn't just a symbol of religious integrity compromised by political power. He's an old man whose foster daughter has become the propaganda arm of a fascist and who is desperately, painfully hoping there's still something of her left inside the apparatus. Those emotional specifics are what make the satire land rather than just preach. Let me sit with some of the individual deaths a bit more, because I moved through them somewhat quickly. A-Train's death is the season's most complete ending so far, and I want to be specific about why. The show spent 4 seasons developing him as someone whose defining characteristic was running, physically, obviously, but also psychologically. He ran from responsibility for Robin's death. He ran from the consequences of his Compound V addiction. He ran from the political implications of who he was working for. He ran from his family when it became inconvenient. Speed for A-Train was always also escape. His final episode inverts this entirely. He goes back to France to reconcile with his brother. He goes back to the place where his family is. And then, when Homelander is there, when the moment comes, he runs toward the danger rather than away from it. He leads Homelander away from the others with the specific intention of drawing fire onto himself. It's the anti-A-Train move. It's the thing he would have been completely incapable of in Season 1. The trip at the end, Jesse T. Usher's final piece of physical storytelling, is heartbreaking in its neatness. He's running from Homelander, and he almost makes it, and then he trips. The same thing that defined him as a character. He trips, and Homelander kills him. It's not poetic justice. It's just his flaw, his inescapable physical history meeting him at the end. He changed. He grew. He did the heroic thing. And then he tripped, because that's the kind of show this is. Kripke said he was initially going to keep A-Train until episode 3 or so, and compressed his arc into a single episode when he moved the death earlier. What's remarkable is that the compression doesn't feel like abbreviation. It feels like the whole story, told at exactly the right pace for what it needed to be. Firecracker's death is different in character, more sudden, more punishing, and less about resolution than about the show making a specific point at a specific moment. She died for doubt, not for action, not for betrayal, for the visible flicker of a question in her eyes when Homelander needed certainty. The show is saying, in this kind of regime, thinking is enough to get you killed. Questioning is treason. The performance of absolute faith has to be total and continuous, or it's inadequate. There's something in that about the nature of the loyalty Homelander actually wants. He doesn't want allies. He doesn't want people who agree with him. He wants people who can't imagine disagreeing, who don't have the internal machinery to produce a doubt. Firecracker had that machinery underneath everything. Greg Dupree put it there, and it killed her. For the deaths that are still coming, Frenchie, Kimiko, the others, what I keep returning to is the cumulative weight. Individual deaths in The Boys are often played with a specific emotional register. Shock, dark humour, quiet devastation. But losing multiple characters from the core group in the same 3-episode stretch will create something different. It'll create the feeling of a world being stripped back to its essential elements, of consequences arriving all at once, of all the accumulated cost of everything the show has been doing since season 1 coming due at the same time. That's what Return of the King actually feels like, to use Kripke's comparison. Not the individual deaths, but the sense that everything is finally being weighed, that the story has been building toward a reckoning, and the reckoning is here. One of the things that makes thinking about what comes after uniquely complicated in The Boys' case is that the franchise doesn't end with season 5. The spin-offs continue. Vought Rising is in development. Gen V has had its second season. The universe expands even as the original show concludes. This creates a peculiar narrative situation. If The Boys season 5 ends with Vought genuinely dismantled, if the institution is so thoroughly destroyed that the corporate framework it represents is unrecognizable, then a 1950s prequel set inside that institution becomes less a continuation of the franchise's concerns and more a period piece. Vought Rising can't really work as a going concern if the company season 5 leaves behind is rubble. More likely, the show ends with Vought changed, restructured, perhaps publicly exposed in ways that shift its power but don't eliminate it, leadership overturned, but institutional machinery continuing. The 1950s prequel then becomes a kind of archaeological dig into how the monster was built, which is a genuinely interesting project if done well. Understanding the origins of something doesn't excuse it, but it does contextualize it. It shows the choices that were made, the people who made them, the moments where different choices might have been possible. The Stan Edgar question matters here because Edgar represents the most sophisticated version of institutional thinking the show has given us. He understood Vought better than anyone, including Homelander. He knew the company was a machine that needed maintenance, and that Homelander was a liability masquerading as an asset. His capture and captivity in season 5 is a kind of suspended animation of that institutional intelligence. He's offline, not dead, potentially still useful to whoever controls him next. If Edgar is used by the Resistance in the final episodes, his usefulness would probably be informational, knowing where the bodies are buried, knowing where the files are, knowing which parts of the Vought structure could be dismantled versus which need to be absorbed into something accountable. He's the Vought equivalent of a dissident insider, which is not a category the show has exactly had before. The question of public accountability is one the show has been circling. How do you tell a public that has been systematically misinformed about the nature of supes and the nature of Vought that they've been lied to, you'd need the evidence, you'd need the platform, and you'd need someone credible enough to be believed. Annie has the platform and the credibility. Edgar might have the evidence. Whether that combination is what actually happens is speculation at this point, but it's the kind of combination that would feel coherent with the show's 5-season interest in information as power. The Gen V characters and what they represent for the future are also part of this. Marie Moreau, Jordan Lee, the others, they're the people who will be doing whatever comes after in the Vought universe. They're the next generation of the story. What they've learnt from everything that happened at Godulkin and from everything happening in Season 5 will shape who they become as characters in whatever spin-off or continuation vehicle tells their next story. The Boys isn't just ending a chapter here, it's passing the baton. Let me add a few more things to the speculation section because there are some threads I didn't pull on that are worth at least mentioning. The question of whether Queen Maeve's return is genuinely surprising or whether the show has been setting it up quietly is one I find interesting. Maeve got her happy ending in Season 4. She left Homelander's orbit, she left Vought, she went to live with Elena somewhere quiet. The show was careful to make that feel real. It wasn't a fake out, it wasn't set up as a she'll be back. She was done. If she comes back in Season 5 and dies, the show is making a specific choice. The world doesn't let people have clean exits. You can walk away, but if you care about the people still fighting, at some point you have to decide whether walking away is something you can live with. Maeve lived through unimaginable things. She was Homelander's partner in the kind of way that leaves marks that don't heal quickly or simply. Whatever brought her back, love for Annie, love for Elena's safety, just the inability to stay out when so much is at stake, would have to be specific and personal enough to make the choice feel real. Whether Dominique McElligott was asked to come back and did it willingly, or whether it was negotiated around the character's narrative needs, is the kind of behind-the-scenes detail we'll probably learn in the post-season interviews. What matters for now is what it would mean if she does die. And I think it would mean the show refuses to believe that anyone who has been part of this world can be fully done with it. The connection is permanent, the cost is permanent, and the final bill comes in the final season. The question of what happens to Ryan after everything is another one I want to spend a moment on. He's been set up as a character who will survive. The show has invested too much in him, and Cameron Crovetti has aged into the role so convincingly for him to be just a casualty. But surviving doesn't mean coming out of this okay. Ryan could end Season 5 alive and still be a deeply wounded person with a very uncertain future. There's a theory that Ryan ends the series as a kind of refugee, not part of the Resistance's victory, not part of any institution, just a young person with extraordinary abilities trying to figure out who he is outside of the war that defined his adolescence. If the virus kills Homelander but not Ryan, if V1 protection is applied specifically enough that Ryan gets the immunity, then he's suddenly a person in a world where his biological father is gone, his adoptive father figure is gone, or a monster, and he has to construct himself from whatever remains. That's the most honest version of what his survival would look like. Not triumph, just continuation in a world that has been stripped of the things that used to define him, which is, in its way, the most hopeful possible ending for his specific story. He gets to find out who he is. He hasn't had that chance yet. The Seth Rogen cameo is one I'm genuinely curious about. He's been an executive producer on The Boys since the beginning, involved in the tone, the voice, the specific flavour of satirical horror the show has cultivated, and apparently he appears on screen in Season 5. What role a Seth Rogen cameo plays in the show's final endgame is entirely opaque to me. It could be genuinely plot relevant, a character he's been developing alongside the writing. It could be a brief appearance as himself in the show's usual celebrity in the world approach. Either way, it's the creator showing up in his own creation. which is a kind of affectionate punctuation mark for a show that has always had a generous sense of humour about itself, even when everything else was dark. One more thought before I move on. The show has always been, underneath everything, a story about friendship. The friendship between Butcher and Huey specifically, which started as manipulation and became something genuine. The friendship within the boys as a group, which formed under pressure and maintained itself through difficulties that would have broken less stubborn bonds. What the finale needs to do, above all the plot mechanics, is give that friendship its due. Whatever happens to each of them individually, the relationship between Huey and Butcher has been the show's spine. It deserves to be the spine of the ending too. I realised I haven't given Huey his own proper section, which is an oversight for a show where he's been the audience surrogate since episode 1. Huey Campbell started the show as a genuinely ordinary person. Not remarkable, not heroic, not particularly capable of violence. He worked in a record shop. He had a girlfriend. His only real quality at the start was a kind of stubborn decency that kept reasserting itself even when circumstances tried to erode it. The show established him as the character we'd follow through the horror, the person most like us in the sense of being most underprepared for what he was about to encounter. Season 5, Huey is a different person in almost every external respect. He's been through years of violence and loss and moral compromise. He's more capable, more hardened, and periodically willing to do things that Season 1 Huey would have been appalled by. He mercy killed his father, which was one of Season 4's most devastating moments. He's been assaulted multiple times in ways that have changed how he relates to his own body and his own safety. He spent a year in a freedom camp, and yet the stubborn decency is still there. That's what makes Huey's arc across the series so quietly remarkable. The show hasn't preserved him in amber. He's genuinely changed, genuinely been damaged, but the core thing that defined him in the first episode keeps finding a way back. He keeps asking whether what they're doing is right. He keeps noticing when Butcher has gone too far. He keeps choosing Annie. He keeps being, essentially, the person who won't stop being a person, even when everything around him makes that extremely difficult. That's the character the show has been carefully protecting. And it's the character who needs to be the one to stop Butcher if the leaked information is correct. Not because Huey is stronger or more capable, he's not, in any physical sense, but because Butcher has always, at some level, known that Huey's moral judgment is better than his own. He recruited Huey partly because of that. The Kessler persona would have no interest in Huey's opinion, but Butcher, the residual Butcher underneath the Kessler overlay, might still respond to it, might still be reachable through it, might still, at the last moment, hear the voice that's been asking the right questions since the beginning. Jack Quaid has grown into this role in a way that wasn't entirely predictable from Season 1. He was charming and grounded in the early seasons, good at playing the fish out of water aspects of Huey's situation. But Season 5 is asking him to play something more interior, more damaged, and he's meeting that ask. The scenes between Huey and Butcher this season have an emotional precision that requires both actors to be doing very specific work, and they both are. If Huey survives, and the show has been too careful about him for too long for me to believe he doesn't, what his life looks like after all of this is hard to imagine. He'll have Annie, he'll have whatever of the world they've managed to protect, and he'll have the specific knowledge of what it cost to get here. That's its own kind of weight to carry forward. But it's also, perhaps, the most hopeful statement the show can make, that someone who carried that weight and kept asking the right questions and kept choosing the human thing is still standing at the end, that approach to the world, stubborn and sometimes insufficient and sometimes punished for it, is the thing that persists. Let me take a broader look at the Vought mythology the show has constructed, because it's one of the more impressive pieces of world building in recent television, and the finale is the culmination of it. Vought International, as depicted in The Boys, is a genuine institution. It has a history that extends back to the 1940s with Frederick Vaught's work. It has a corporate evolution that moves through different CEOs with different visions. Vought himself, whoever came between him and Stillwell, Madeline Stillwell, Stan Edgar. Each of them represents a different phase of the company's relationship to its product, from true believer science to brand management to pure institutional power. The supes are Vaught's most visible product, but the show has always been clear that they're not the core product. The core product is the idea, the public belief in superheroism as a genuine phenomenon, as a manifestation of virtue and American exceptionalism. That idea is what Vought sells. The supes are just the proof of concept. If you can sell the idea strongly enough that people need it to be true, you have something more valuable than any individual performer. You have a mythology. This is the insight that makes the Season 5 religious turn feel thematically coherent rather than just novel. Vought was always in the mythology business. Religion is just a particular form of mythology, one with deeper emotional roots and more institutional durability than superhero branding. Moving from Homelander saves America to Homelander is America's savior is a smaller step than it might appear. It's the same product, more effectively distributed. What the show has done across 5 seasons is trace the logical development of that project. What happens when the mythology is too successfully sold? When the person embodying it starts to believe it themselves and acts accordingly? What happens when the institution that created the mythology loses control of it? What happens when ordinary people, confronted with the truth about what the mythology cost, have to decide whether they still need to believe? The finale, in this frame, is the test of whether the mythology can be genuinely dismantled or whether it just takes new form. Killing Homelander removes the current embodiment of the myth, but the myth itself, the idea that there are people among us who are more important, more powerful, more worthy than others, and that this is not only okay but good, that's much harder to kill. The show knows this. It's been the show's subject from the beginning. Whether it can end on a note of genuine hope about this, whether it can suggest that the myth can be refused, not just embodied differently, is the biggest question it has left to answer. One thing I haven't mentioned that's worth a brief note is the music, because The Boys has always used its soundtrack in very specific, often jarring ways, and Season 5 is doing something slightly different. The show has a long history of deploying recognisable pop and rock songs at moments of maximum tonal contrast. The cheerful playing over the violent, the tender playing over the terrible. It's a technique that Tarantino made famous, and that The Boys has used to very effective ends across its run. The Season 4 finale used Nirvana's heart-shaped box in a way that was both aesthetically perfect and narratively significant, since the heart-shaped box imagery connected to the Kessler vision and the choice Butcher made. Season 5 has been slightly more restrained with this technique, or at least it appears that way in the first 5 episodes. The show is using music less as punctuation and more as atmosphere in several scenes, which creates a different emotional register, less ironic distance, more direct emotional engagement. Whether this is an intentional choice to signal the series moving into a more earnest, final phase, or just the natural consequence of having a season where the tonal contrast between the show's satirical elements and its emotional ones is more openly stated rather than implied, is something I'm not entirely sure about. But it's worth noting because the music has always been part of how The Boys communicates what it thinks about what it's showing you. The songs are never neutral. They're always pointing at something, at irony, at grief, at beauty in the wrong place. The way Season 5's final 3 episodes choose to use or not use that technique will tell you something about what the show wants you to feel about its ending. There's a criticism that's followed The Boys since Season 1, that the show uses shock and gore as a substitute for substance. And I want to address that directly, because it's not quite right, but it's not entirely wrong either. The show's violence and sexual content are at their best doing specific satirical work. When Homelander's fetishes are depicted, It's not for prurient interest. It's to make the point that the most powerful person in the world is also the most psychologically stunted, and that those two things exist simultaneously without resolving each other. When the gore reaches cartoonish extremes, it's often the show's way of making real something that we'd otherwise be able to hold at a comfortable distance. The violence against civilians, in particular, has always been the show's most deliberate choice, making us see the cost of unchecked superhuman power in the most concrete possible terms. But there are moments, and Season 5 hasn't been entirely immune to them, where the excess becomes self-indulgent, where the show is doing something disgusting because it can, rather than because it illuminates anything. The love sausage death is the most recent example. It's funny in a deeply wrong way, it's completely in keeping with the show's aesthetic, and it also doesn't add anything to the Season 5 argument the way that some of the other deaths do. It's the show enjoying itself, which is fine, but it's worth being honest about. The test, I think, for any piece of excess in The Boys is, does this tell you something about the world it's depicting, or does it just push a boundary? The best examples, the Season 1 scene with Robin, Homelander on the rooftop in Season 2, the Season 3 Compound Vi episode that explores Soldier Boy's history, pass that test clearly. The gross outset pieces that are there for comedy do something else. They maintain the register that allows the show to do the serious things, their tonal calibration. Without them, the show would feel more conventionally grim. With them, the serious moments land differently because you've been conditioned to expect anything. In a final season, this balance matters more than it did in earlier ones. The show can't afford to have its most important emotional moments undercut by gratuitous material in the same episode. Whether the final 3 episodes manage that, whether they know when to deploy the excess and when to step back from it, is one of the craft questions I'm watching for. Kripke, for what it's worth, has always seemed aware of this. His statements about Season 5 being diabolical, but also having real emotional weight, suggest he's trying to hold both things at once. The violence will be there, the darkness will be there, but the feeling is also going to be there, for the people and the story. That balance, maintained consistently, is what would make the final season genuinely great, rather than just impressive. Before we reach the closing, let me just reflect on why this show matters to me, and maybe to you if you've been watching it. The Boys is not a comfortable show. That's the first thing. It refuses comfort. It doesn't let you feel good about the things that don't deserve good feelings. It doesn't give you clean heroes or clean victories or clean moral positions. It presents a world that resembles ours in specific and uncomfortable ways and asks you to look at it without the usual reassurances that fiction offers. And yet it's extremely watchable, which shouldn't work but does. The reason it works is that underneath the satire and the violence and the grimness, it's genuinely interested in people, in the specific, peculiar, contradictory texture of human beings trying to do right by each other in circumstances that make it very difficult. Frenchie loving Kimiko, Huey loving Annie, Mother's Milk missing his family, Ryan wanting to be a normal kid. These are recognisable things, familiar feelings, and the show holds them with the same attention it gives to everything else. That combination, political intelligence and human warmth, satirical sharpness and genuine emotional investment, is what makes it worth 5 seasons of attention. Not many shows manage it. Most shows are either smart or warm. The Boys has consistently been both, and in the final season that combination is more apparent than ever because the stakes of losing either quality are higher. Television that takes the world seriously and takes people seriously at the same time is rare. This show has done it for 7 years. That's worth something. That deserves an ending that honours both halves of what it's been. I think it'll get one, and the 20th of May will tell us whether I'm right. One last thought I want to add before the closing, because it's been sitting at the back of my head throughout all of this. Homelander is one of the loneliest characters in recent television. And I don't mean that is a sympathetic observation, though it can be that too. I mean it as a structural one. He has no one who knows him. Every relationship he has is managed, performed, strategic. The people closest to him are either terrified of him, exploiting him, or operating at enough of a remove that genuine knowledge is impossible. Firecracker didn't know him. Ashley doesn't know him. Soldier Boy is his biological father, and they've spent, a few weeks in each other's company. Even his son Ryan, who is the closest thing to unconditional that Homelander has ever had, has spent most of Season 5 running from him or trying to fight him. What does it do to a person to have that much power and that much loneliness together? The show's answer, developed across 5 seasons, is it makes you more and more dangerous in a very specific way. Not unpredictably violent, though that too. Primarily, it makes you increasingly unable to tolerate anything that looks like criticism or refusal, because criticism and refusal are the things that remind you that you're not loved in the way you need to be loved. Every escalation in Homelander's behaviour across the series can be traced back to this dynamic. He kills when he feels his image is threatened. He punishes doubt, as Firecracker discovered. He destroys the things that most clearly show him what he isn't, because being shown what you aren't is the most effective way of reminding someone of what they lack. The religious project of Season 5 is, in this frame, the logical endpoint. Worship eliminates the possibility of genuine knowledge. If people worship you, they don't get to see you. They see the symbol. They see the idea. They see whatever mythology has been constructed around you. The actual person, the damaged, needy, terrifying person, is completely invisible within the structure of worship, which is, for Homelander, the closest thing to safety he's ever found. Not love, not connection, but a version of attention that can never disappoint him because it was never about him in the first place. That's one of the saddest things the show has produced, and they're here tucked inside all the other things it's doing. And I think it matters that we recognise it, even as we're also clear that the sadness doesn't change anything about the consequences of his choices. You can understand exactly why someone became what they are and still believe they need to be stopped. Both things can be true. The Boys, to its credit, has always insisted on both. There's something worth saying about The Boys as a collective before we finish, because the show has always been as interested in the group as it is in the individuals, and the group has changed so much across 5 seasons that it almost doesn't resemble what it started as. Season 1, Boys, Butcher, Huey, Mother's Milk, Frenchie, Kimiko, this last edition coming partway through. A ragtag collection of people with personal grievances against supes, operating illegally, using Grace Mallory's CIA connections for cover, constantly under-equipped and outmatched. The whole texture was of people improvising, of people who were doing this because they couldn't not do it, not because they had a plan. Season 5 Boys, the same people, except radically different. A year in a freedom camp, Compound V tentacles, deaths along the way, new allies from Gen V, from the Resistance, from unexpected corners, a virus that could kill everyone or save everyone depending on how it's used, an enemy who controls the country. None of the improvisation has gone away. The Boys has always improvised, even when they had resources, but the stakes of getting things wrong have multiplied to a point that would have been unimaginable in episode 1. What the group represents, taken as a whole, is a specific idea about how resistance works. Not through superior power, not through institutional legitimacy, through persistence, through the refusal to accept that the situation is fixed, through the knowledge that even badly outmatched people can be significant if they keep choosing to be. The Boys have been outmatched since the beginning. That's never changed. What changes is what being outmatched does to you, whether it convinces you it's hopeless, or whether it clarifies exactly what needs to be done. Butcher's corruption is partly a story about what it does to you to be outmatched, for long enough that you start looking for whatever advantage you can find, regardless of the cost. MM's steadiness is a story about what it looks like to be outmatched and stay true to your values anyway. Frenchie and Kimiko are a story about what it looks like to find something worth living for in the middle of being outmatched. Huey and Annie are a story about what it looks like to choose each other through it. None of these are simple, all of them are human, and their convergence in the final 3 episodes of the show is going to be everything the show has been building toward, and that, I think, is where this conversation can rest for tonight.